The Duke of Medina Sidonia and Rodrigo Ponce de Leon Marques of Cadiz were sponsors, and all the chivalry of the camp was assembled on the occasion. The prince, after he was knighted, bestowed the same honor on several youthful cavaliers of high rank, just entering like himself on the career of arms. Ferdinand did not loiter in carrying his desolating plans into execution. He detached parties in every direction to lay waste. The country villages were sacked, burnt, and destroyed, and the lovely Vega was once more laid waste with fire. And sword the ravage was carried so close to Granada that the city was wrapped in the smoke of its gardens, and hamlets the dismal cloud rolled up the hill and hung about the towers of the Alhambra, where the unfortunate Boabdil still remained shut up from the indignation of his subjects. The hapless monarch smote his breast, as he looked down from his mountain palace, on the desolation effected by his late ally. He dared not even show himself in arms among the populace, for they cursed him, as the cause of the miseries once more brought to their doors. The Moors, however, did not suffer the Christians to carry on their ravages unmolested. As in former years, Musa incited them to incessant sallies. He divided his cavalry into small squadrons, each led by a daring commander. They were taught to hover round the Christian camp to harass it from various and opposite quarters, cutting off convoys and straggling detachments, to waylay the army in its ravaging expeditions, lurking among rocks and passes of the mountains, or in hollows and thickets of the plain, and practicing 1,000 stratagems and surprises. The Christian army had one day spread itself out rather unguardedly in its foraging about the Vega. As the troops commanded by the Marques of Villena approached the skirts of the mountains, they beheld a number of Moorish peasants hastily driving a herd of cattle into a narrow glen. The soldiers, eager for booty, pressed in pursuit of them. Scarcely had they entered the glen when shouts arose from every side, and they were furiously attacked by an ambuscade of horse and foot. Some of the Christians took to flight, others stood their ground and fought valiantly. The Moors had the vantage ground, some showered darts and arrows from the cliffs of the rocks, others fought hand to hand on the plain, while their cavalry carried havoc and confusion into the midst of the Christian forces. The Marques de Villena, with his brother Don Alonso de Pacheco, at the first onset of the Moors, spurred into the hottest of the fight. They had scarce entered, when Don Alonso was struck lifeless from his horse. Before the eyes of his brother Estevan, Luzon, a gallant captain, fell, fighting bravely by the side of the Marques, who remained with his chamberlain Solar, and a handful of knights, surrounded by the enemy. Several cavaliers from other parts of the army hastened to their assistance, when King Ferdinand, seeing that the Moors had the vantage ground and that the Christians were suffering, severely gave signal for retreat. The Marques obeyed slowly and reluctantly, for his heart was full of grief and rage at the death of his brother. As he was retiring, he beheld his faithful chamberlain Solar defending himself valiantly against 6 Moors. The Marques turned and rushed to his rescue. He killed 2 of the enemy with his own hand, and put the rest to flight. One of the Moors, however, in retreating, rose in his stirrups, and hurling his lance at the Marques, wounded him in the right arm and crippled him for life. In consequence of this wound, the Marques was ever after obliged to write his signature with his left hand, though capable of managing his lance with his right. The Queen one day demanded of him why he had adventured his life for that of a domestic. "Does not your majesty think," replied he, "that I ought to risk 1 life for him who would have adventured 3 for me, had he possessed them?" The Queen was charmed with the magnanimity of the reply, and often quoted the Marques as setting an heroic example to the chivalry of the age. Mariana Lib. 25, Roman 100. Such was one of the many ambuscados concerted by Musa, nor did he hesitate at times to present a bold front to the Christian forces and defy them in the open field. Ferdinand soon perceived, however, that the Moors seldom provoked a battle without having the advantage of the ground, and that though the Christians generally appeared to have the victory, they suffered the greatest loss, for retreating was a part of the Moorish system, by which they would draw their pursuers into confusion, and then turn upon them with a more violent and fatal attack. He commanded his captains, therefore, to decline all challenges to skirmish and pursue a secure system of destruction, ravaging the country, and doing all possible injury to the enemy with slight risk to themselves. Chapter Roman 85, The Fate of the Castle of Roma. About 2 leagues from Granada, on an eminence commanding an extensive view of the Vega, stood the strong Moorish castle of Roma. Hither the neighboring peasantry drove their flocks and herds, and hurried with their most precious effects on the irruption of a Christian force, and any foraging or skirmishing party from Granada, on being intercepted in their return threw themselves into Roma manned its embattled towers and set the enemy at defiance. The garrison were accustomed to have parties of Moors clattering up to their gates, so hotly pursued that there was barely time to throw open the portal, receive them within, and shut out their pursuers, while the Christian cavaliers had many a time reined up their panting steeds at the very entrance of the barbican, and retired cursing the strong walls of Roma that robbed them of their prey. The late ravages of Ferdinand and the continual skirmishings in the Vega had roused the vigilance of the castle one morning early. As the sentinels kept watch upon the battlements, they beheld a cloud of dust advancing rapidly from a distance. Turbans and Moorish weapons soon caught their eyes, and as the whole approached they descried a drove of cattle, urged on in great haste, and convoyed by 150 Moors, who led with them 2 Christian captives in chains. When the cavalcada arrived near the castle, a Moorish cavalier of noble and commanding mien and splendid attire rode up to the foot of the tower and entreated admittance. He stated that they were returning with rich booty from a foray into the lands of the Christians, but that the enemy was on their traces, and they feared to be overtaken before they could reach Granada. The sentinels descended in all haste and flung open the gates. The long cavalcada defiled into the courts of the castle, which were soon filled with bleating and lowing flocks and herds, with neighing and stamping steeds, and with fierce-looking Moors from the mountains. The cavalier who had asked admission was the chief of the party. He was somewhat advanced in life, of a lofty and gallant bearing, and had with him a son, a young man of great spirit and fire. Close by them followed the 2 Christian captives with looks cast down and disconsolate. The soldiers of the garrison had roused themselves from their sleep, and were busily occupied attending to the cattle, which crowded the courts, while the foraging party distributed themselves about the castle to seek refreshment or repose. Suddenly a shout arose that was echoed from courtyard and hall and battlement. The garrison, astonished and bewildered, would have rushed to their arms, but found themselves almost before they could make resistance completely in the power of an enemy. The pretended foraging party consisted of Mudexirs or Moors tributary to the Christians, and the commanders were the Prince Cid Hayya and his son Alnayar. They had hastened from the mountains with this small force to aid the Catholic sovereigns during the summer's campaign, and had concerted to surprise this important castle and present it to King Ferdinand as a gauge of their faith and the first fruits of their devotion. The politic monarch overwhelmed his new converts and allies with favors and distinctions in return for this important acquisition, but he took care to dispatch a strong force of veteran and genuine Christian troops to man the fortress. As to the Moors who had composed the garrison, Cid Hayya remembered that they were his countrymen and could not prevail upon himself to deliver them into Christian bondage. He set them at liberty and permitted them to repair to Granada. Proof, says the pious Agapida, that his conversion was not entirely consummated, but that there were still some lingerings of the infidel in his heart. His lenity was far from procuring him indulgence in the opinions of his countrymen. On the contrary, the inhabitants of Granada, when they learnt from the liberated garrison the stratagem by which Roma had been captured, cursed Cid Hayya for a traitor, and the garrison joined in the malediction. Pulgar Cron Part 3, Cap 130, Cura de los Palacios, Cap 90. But the indignation of the people of Granada was destined to be roused to tenfold violence. The old warrior Muley Abdallah El Zagal had retired to his little mountain territory, and for a short time endeavored to console himself with his petty title of King of Andarax. He soon grew impatient, however, of the quiet and inaction of his mimic kingdom. His fierce spirit was exasperated by being shut up within such narrow limits, and his hatred rose to downright fury against Boabdil, whom he considered as the cause of his downfall. When tidings were brought him that King Ferdinand was laying waste the Vega, he took a sudden resolution, assembling the whole disposable force of his kingdom, which amounted but to 200 men. He descended from the Alpuxerras, and sought the Christian camp content to serve as a vassal, the enemy of his faith and his nation, so that he might see Granada wrested from the sway of his nephew. In his blind passion, the old wrathful monarch injured his cause and strengthened the cause of his adversary. The Moors of Granada had been clamorous in his praise, extolling him as a victim to his patriotism, and had refused to believe all reports of his treaty with the Christians. But when they beheld from the walls of the city his banner mingling with the banners of the unbelievers, and arrayed against his late people, and the capital he had commanded, they broke forth into revilings and heaped curses upon his name. Their next emotion, of course, was in favor of Boabdil. They gathered under the walls of the Alhambra, and hailed him as their only hope, as the sole dependence of the country. Boabdil could scarcely believe his senses when he heard his name mingled with praises, and greeted with acclamations encouraged by this unexpected gleam of popularity, he ventured forth from his retreat, and was received with rapture. All his past errors were attributed to the hardships of his fortune, and the usurpation of his tyrant uncle, and whatever breath the populace could spare from uttering curses on El Zagal was expended in shouts in honor of El Chico. Chapter Roman 86 How Boabdil El Chico took the field, and his expedition against Alhambra. For 30 days had the Vega been overrun by the Christian forces, and that vast plain late so luxuriant and beautiful was one wide scene of desolation. The destroying army, having accomplished its task, passed over the bridge of Pinos, and wound up into the mountains on the way to Cordova, bearing away the spoils of towns and villages, and driving off flocks and herds in long dusty columns. The sound of the last Christian trumpet died away along the side of the mountain of Elvira, and not a hostile squadron was seen glistening on the mournful fields of the Vega. The eyes of Boabdil El Chico were at length opened to the real policy of King Ferdinand, and he saw that he had no longer anything to depend upon, but the valor of his arm. No time was to be lost in hastening to counteract the effect of the late Christian ravage and in opening the channel for distant supplies to Granada. Scarcely had the retiring squadrons of Ferdinand disappeared among the mountains, when Boabdil buckled on his armor, sallied forth from the Alhambra, and prepared to take the field when the populace beheld him actually in arms against his late ally. Both parties thronged with zeal to his standard the hardy inhabitants also of the Sierra Nevada, or chain of snow-capped mountains which rise above Granada, descended from their heights, and hastened into the city gates to proffer their devotion to their youthful king. The great square of the Vivarambla shone with legions of cavalry, decked with the colors and devices of the most ancient Moorish families, and marshaled forth by the patriot Musa to follow the king to battle. It was on the 15th of June that Boabdil once more issued forth from the gates of Granada on martial enterprise, a few leagues from the city within full view of it, and at the entrance of the Alpuxerras mountains stood the powerful castle of Alhambra. It was built on an eminence rising from the midst of a small town, and commanding a great part of the Vega and the main road to the rich valleys of the Alpuxerras. The castle was commanded by a valiant Christian cavalier named Mendo de Quexada and garrisoned by 250 men, all seasoned and experienced warriors. It was a continual thorn in the side of Granada. The laborers of the Vega were swept off from their fields, by its hardy soldiers convoys were cut off in the passes of the mountains, and as the garrison commanded a full view of the gates of the city, no band of merchants could venture forth on their needful journeys without being swooped up by the warhawks of Alhambra. It was against this important fortress that Boabdil first led his troops, and for 6 days and nights it was closely besieged. The alcalde and his veteran garrison defended themselves valiantly, but were exhausted by fatigue and constant watchfulness, for the Moors, being continually relieved by fresh troops from Granada, kept up an unremitted and vigorous attack. Twice the barbican was forced, and twice the assailants were driven forth headlong, with excessive loss. The garrison, however, was diminished in number by the killed and wounded. There were no longer soldiers sufficient to man the walls and gateway, and the brave alcalde was compelled to retire with his surviving force to the keep of the castle, in which he continued to make a desperate resistance. The Moors now approached the foot of the tower under shelter of wooden screens, covered with wet hides to ward off missiles and combustibles. They went to work vigorously to undermine the tower, placing props of wood under the foundations, to be afterward set on fire so as to give the besiegers time to escape before the edifice should fall. Some of the Moors plied their crossbows and arquebuses to defend the workmen and drive the Christians from the walls, while the latter showered down stones and darts and melted pitch and flaming combustibles on the miners. The brave Mendo de Quexada had cast many an anxious eye across the Vega in hopes of seeing some Christian force hastening to his assistance. Not a gleam of spear or helm was to be descried, for no one had dreamt of this sudden eruption of the Moors. The alcalde beheld his bravest men dead or wounded around him, while the remainder were sinking with watchfulness and fatigue. In defiance of all opposition, the Moors had accomplished their mine. The fire was brought before the walls that was to be applied to the stanchions. In case the garrison persisted in defense, in a little while the tower would crumble beneath him and be rent, and hurled a ruin to the plain. At the very last moment, the brave alcalde made the signal of surrender. He marched forth with the remnant of his veteran garrison, who were all made prisoners. Boabdil immediately ordered the walls of the fortress to be razed and fire to be applied to the stanchions, that the place might never again become a stronghold to the Christians and a scourge to Granada the Alcade, and his fellow captives were led in dejected convoy across the Vega. When they heard a tremendous crash behind them, they turned to look upon their late fortress, but beheld nothing but a heap of tumbling ruins and a vast column of smoke and dust where once had stood the lofty tower of Alhambra. Chapter Roman exploit of the Count de Tendilla. Boabdil el Chico followed up his success by capturing the two fortresses of Marchena and Albaladni belonging to Cid Hayya. He also sent his alfaquies in every direction to proclaim a holy war, and to summon all true Moslems of town, or castle mountain, or valley to saddle steed, and buckle on armor and hasten to the standard of the faith. The tidings spread far and wide that Boabdil el Chico was once more in the field, and was victorious. The Moors of various places, dazzled by this gleam of success, hastened to throw off their sworn allegiance to the Castilian crown, and to elevate the standard of Boabdil, and the youthful monarch flattered himself that the whole kingdom was on the point of returning to its allegiance. The fiery cavaliers of Granada, eager to renew those forays into the Christian lands, in which they had formerly delighted, concerted an eruption to the north, into the territory of Jaen, to harass the country about Quezada. They had heard of a rich convoy of merchants and wealthy travelers on the way to the city of Baza, and anticipated a glorious conclusion to their foray in capturing this convoy. Assembling a number of horsemen lightly armed and fleetly mounted, and 100 foot soldiers, they issued forth by night from Granada, made their way in silence through the defiles of the mountains, crossed the frontier without opposition, and suddenly appeared, as if fallen from the clouds in the very heart of the Christian country. The mountainous frontier which separates Granada from Jaen was at this time under the command of the Count de Tendilla, the same veteran who had distinguished himself by his vigilance and sagacity. When commanding the fortress of Alhama, he held his headquarters at the city of Alcala, La Real in its impregnable fortress perched high among the mountains about 6 leagues from Granada, and dominating all the frontier from this cloud-kept hold. He kept an eagle eye upon Granada, and had his scouts and spies in all directions, so that a crow could not fly over the border without his knowledge. His fortress was a place of refuge for the Christian captives who escaped by night from the Moorish dungeons of Granada. Often, however, they missed their way in the defiles of the mountains, and wandering about bewildered either repaired by mistake to some Moorish town, or were discovered and retaken at daylight by the enemy. To prevent these accidents, the Count had a tower built at his own expense on the top of one of the heights near Alcala, which commanded a view of the Vega and the surrounding country. Here, he kept a light blazing throughout the night as a beacon for all Christian fugitives to guide them to a place of safety. The Count was aroused one night from his repose by shouts and cries, which came up from the town, and approached the castle walls. To arms, the Moor is over the border, was the cry. A Christian soldier, pale and emaciated, who still bore traces of Moorish chains, was brought before the Count. He had been taken as guide by the Moorish cavaliers who had sallied from Granada, but had escaped from them among the mountains, and after much wandering had found his way to Alcala by the signal fire. Notwithstanding the bustle and agitation of the moment, the Count de Tendilla listened calmly and attentively to the account of the fugitive, and questioned him minutely as to the time of departure of the Moors, and the rapidity and direction of their march. He saw that it was too late to prevent their incursion and ravage, but he determined to await them, and give them a warm reception on their return. His soldiers were always on the alert, and ready to take the field at a moment's warning, choosing 150 lances, hardy and valiant men, well disciplined, and well seasoned as, indeed, were all his troops. Issued forth quietly before break of day, and descending through the defiles of the mountains, stationed his little force in ambush in a deep barranca, or dry channel of a torrent near Barzana, but 3 leagues from Granada, on the road by which the marauders would have to return. In the meantime, he sent out scouts to post themselves upon different heights, and look out for the approach of the enemy. All day they remained concealed in the ravine, and for a great part of the following night not a Moor, however, was to be seen, excepting now and then a peasant returning from his labor, or a solitary muleteer hastening toward Granada. The cavaliers of the Count began to grow restless and impatient, fearing that the enemy might have taken some other route, or might have received intelligence of their ambuscade. They urged the Count to abandon the enterprise and return to Alcala. "We are here," said they, "almost at the gates of the Moorish capital. Our movements may have been discreet, and before we are aware Granada may pour forth its legions of swift cavalry, and crush us with an overwhelming force." The Count, however, persisted in remaining, until his scouts should come in about 2 hours before daybreak. there were signal fires on certain Moorish watchtowers of the mountains. While they were regarding these with anxiety, the scouts came hurrying into the ravine. The Moors are approaching. Said they, we have reconnoitered them, near at hand they are. Between 100 and 200 strong, but encumbered with many prisoners and much booty, the Christian cavaliers laid their ears to the ground, and heard the distant tramp of horses, and the tread of foot soldiers. They mounted their horses, braced their shields, couched their lances, and drew near to the entrance of the ravine, where it opened upon the road. The Moors had succeeded in waylaying and surprising the Christian convoy on its way to Baza. They had captured a great number of prisoners, male and female, with great store of gold and jewels, and sumpter mules laden with rich merchandise. With these they had made a forced march over the dangerous parts of the mountains, but now finding themselves so near to Granada, fancied themselves in perfect security. They loitered along the road therefore irregularly, and slowly, some singing, others laughing and exulting at having eluded the boasted vigilance of the Count de Tendilla, while ever and anon was heard the plaint of some female captive, bewailing the jeopardy of her honor, or the heavy sighing of the merchant at beholding his property in the grasp of ruthless spoilers. The Count waited until some of the escort had passed the ravine, then giving the signal for assault, his cavaliers set up great shouts and cries, and charged into the center of the foe. The obscurity of the place, and the hour added to the terrors of the surprise. The Moors were thrown into confusion. Some rallied, fought desperately, and fell covered with wounds. 36 were killed, and 55 were made prisoners. The rest, under cover of the darkness, made their escape to the rocks and defiles of the mountains. The good Count unbound the prisoners, gladdening the hearts of the merchants by restoring to them their merchandise to the female captives. Also he restored the jewels of which they had been despoiled, excepting such as had been lost beyond recovery. 4 to 5 saddle horses of the choice Barbary breed remained as captured spoils of the Moors, together with costly armor and booty of various kinds. Having collected everything in haste and arranged his cavalcada, the Count urged his way with all speed for Alcala la Real, lest he should be pursued and overtaken by the Moors of Granada. As he wound up the steep ascent to his mountain-city, the inhabitants poured forth to meet him with shouts of joy. His triumph was doubly enhanced by being received at the gates of the city by his wife, the daughter of the Marks of Villena, a lady of distinguished merit, whom he had not seen for 2 years, during which he had been separated from his home by the arduous duties of these iron wars. We have yet another act to relate of this good Count de Tendilla, who was in truth a mirror of knightly virtue. One day, a Christian soldier just escaped from captivity in Granada brought word to the Count that an illustrious damsel named Fatima, niece of the Alcalde Ibn Comixa, was to leave the city on a certain day, escorted by a numerous party of relatives and friends of distinguished rank, on a journey to Almanecar, there to embark for the African coast to celebrate her nuptials with the Alcalde of Tetuan. This was too brilliant a prize to be neglected. The Count accordingly sallied forth with a light company of cavalry, and descending the defiles of the mountains, stationed himself behind the rocky Sierra of Elvira, not far from the eventful bridge of Pinos, within a few short miles of Granada. Hence, he detached Alonso de Cardenas Aloa with 50 light horsemen to post himself in ambush by the road the bridal party had to travel. After a time, the latter came in sight, proving less numerous than had been expected, for the damsel was escorted merely by 4 armed domestics, and accompanied by a few relatives and 2 female attendants. The whole party was surrounded and captured almost without resistance, and carried off to the Count at the bridge of Pinos. The good Count conveyed his beautiful captive to his stronghold at Alcala, where he treated her and her companions with all the delicacy and respect due to their rank, and to his own character as a courteous cavalier. The tidings of the capture of his niece gave poignant affliction to the vizier Ibn Comixa. His royal master Boabdil, of whom he was the prime favorite and confidential adviser, sympathized in his distress. With his own hand, he wrote a letter to the Count offering, in exchange for the fair Fatima, 100 Christian captives to be chosen from those detained in Granada. This royal letter was sent by Don Francisco de Zuniga, an Aragonese cavalier, whom Ibn Comixa held in captivity, and who was set at liberty for the purpose. On receiving the letter of Boabdil, the Count de Tendilla at once gave freedom to the Moorish maid, making her a magnificent present of jewels, and sending her and her companions under honorable escort to the very gates of Granada. Boabdil, exceeding his promises, immediately set free 20 captive priests, 130 Castilian and Aragonese cavaliers, and a number of peasant women. His favorite and vizier Ibn Comixa was so rejoiced at the liberation of his niece, and so struck with the chivalrous conduct of her captor, that he maintained from that day, a constant and amicable correspondence with the Count de Tendilla, and became in the hands of the latter one of the most efficacious agents in bringing the War of Granada to a triumphant close. This interesting anecdote of the Count de Tendilla, which is a key to the subsequent conduct of the vizier Ibn Comixa, and had a singular influence on the fortunes of Boabdil and his kingdom, is originally given in a manuscript history of the Counts of Tendilla written about the middle of the 16th century by Gabriel Rodriguez de Ardila, a Granadine clergyman. It has been brought to light recently by the Researches of Alcantara for his History of Granada Vol. 4 Cap 18. Chapter Roman 88 Expedition of Boabdil el Chico against Salabran exploit of Hernan Perez del Pulgar. King Boabdil found that his diminished territory was too closely dominated by Christian fortresses like Alcala la Real and too strictly watched by vigilant alcaides like the Count of Tendilla to be able to maintain itself by internal resources. His foraging expeditions were liable to be intercepted and defeated, while the ravage of the Vega had swept off everything on which the city depended for future sustenance. He felt the want of a seaport through which, as formerly, he might keep open a communication with Africa and obtain reinforcements and supplies from beyond the sea. All the ports and harbors were in the hands of the Christians, and Granada, and its remnant of dependent territory, were completely landlocked. In this emergency, the attention of Boabdil was called by circumstances to the seaport of Salabrena. This redoubtable town has already been mentioned in this chronicle, as a place deemed impregnable by the Moors, insomuch that their kings were accustomed in time of peril to keep their treasures in its citadel. It was situated on a high rocky hill, dividing one of those rich little Vegas or plains which lie open to the Mediterranean, but run like deep green bays into the stern bosoms of the mountains. The Vega was covered with beautiful vegetation, with rice and cotton, with groves of oranges, citrons, figs, and mulberries, and with gardens enclosed by hedges of reeds of aloes, and the Indian fig running streams of cool water from the springs and snows of the Sierra Nevada, kept this delightful valley continually fresh and verdant, while it was almost locked up by mountain barriers and lofty promontories stretching far into the sea. Through the center of this rich Vega the rock of Salabrena reared its rugged back, nearly dividing the plain, and advancing to the margin of the sea, with just a strip of sandy beach at its foot, laved by the blue waves of the Mediterranean. The town covered the ridge and sides of the rocky hill, and was fortified by strong walls and towers, while on the highest and most precipitate part stood the citadel, a huge castle that seemed to form a part of the living rock, the massive ruins of which at the present day attract the gaze of the traveler as he winds his way far below along the road through the Vega. This important fortress had been entrusted to the command of Don Francisco Ramirez de Madrid, Captain General of the Artillery, and the most scientific of all the Spanish leaders. That experienced veteran, however, was with the king at Cordova, having left a valiant cavalier as alcaide of the place. Boabdil had full information of the state of the garrison, and the absence of its commander putting himself at the head of a powerful force. Therefore he departed from Granada, and made a rapid march through the mountains, hoping to seize upon Salabrena before King Ferdinand could come to its assistance. The inhabitants of Salabrena were Mudexiers or Moors, who had sworn allegiance to the Christians. Still, when they heard the sound of the Moorish drums and trumpets, and beheld the squadrons of their countrymen advancing across the Vega, their hearts yearned toward the standard of their nation, and their faith. A tumult arose in the place. The populace shouted the name of Boabdil el Chico, and throwing open the gates admitted him within the walls. The Christian garrison was too few in number to contend for the possession of the town. They retreated to the citadel, and shut themselves within its massive walls, which were considered impregnable here. They maintained a desperate defense, hoping to hold out until succor should arrive from the neighboring fortresses. The tidings that Salabrena was invested by the Moorish king spread along the seacoast, and filled the Christians with alarm. Don Francisco Enriquez, uncle of the king, commanded the city of Vélez Málaga, about 12 leagues distant, but separated by ranges of those vast rocky mountains, which are piled along the Mediterranean and tower in steep promontories and precipices above its waves. Don Francisco summoned the alcaides of his district to hasten with him to the relief of this important fortress, a number of cavaliers, and their retainers answered to his call, among whom was Hernan Perez del Pulgar, surnamed El de las Hazanas, he of the exploits, same, who had signalized himself in a foray by elevating a handkerchief on a lance for a banner, and leading on his disheartened comrades to victory As soon as Don Francisco beheld a little band collected round him, he set out with all speed for Salabrena. The march was rugged and severe climbing, and descending immense mountains, and sometimes winding along the edge of giddy precipices with the surges of the sea raging far below. When Don Francisco arrived with his followers at the lofty promontory that stretches along one side of the little vega of Salabrena, he looked down with sorrow and anxiety upon a Moorish army of great force, encamped at the foot of the fortress, while Moorish banners on various parts of the walls proved that the town was already in possession of the infidels. A solitary Christian standard alone floated on the top of the castle keep, showing that the brave garrison were hemmed up in their rock-built citadel. They were in fact reduced to great extremity through want of water and provisions. Don Francisco found it impossible with his small force to make any impression on the camp of the Moors, or to get to the relief of the castle. He stationed his little band upon a rocky height near the sea where they were safe from the assaults of the enemy. The sight of his friendly banner waving in their neighborhood cheered the heart of the garrison, and gave them assurance of speedy succor from the king, while the hostile menaces of Don Francisco served to check the attacks of the Moors upon the citadel. In the meantime, Hernan Perez del Pulgar, who always burned to distinguish himself by bold and striking exploits, had discovered in the course of his prowlings a postern gate of the castle opening upon the steep part of the rocky hill. Looking toward the mountains, the thought occurred to him that by a bold dash at a favorable moment, this postern might be attained, and succor thrown into the castle. He pointed the place out to his comrades. "Who will follow my banner," said he, "and make a dash for yonder postern?" A bold proposition, in time of warfare, never wants for bold spirits to accept it. 70 resolute men stepped forward to second him. Pulgar chose the early daybreak for his enterprise, when the Moors, just aroused from sleep, were changing guard, and making the various arrangements of the morning. Favored by these movements, and the drowsiness of the hour, Pulgar approached the Moorish line. Silently and steadily, most of his followers armed with crossbows and espingardas, or muskets. Then suddenly making an onset, they broke through a weak part of the camp, before the alarm had spread through the army, and succeeded in fighting their way up to the gate, which was eagerly thrown open to receive them. The garrison, roused to new spirit by this unlooked-for reinforcement, was enabled to make a more vigorous resistance. The Moors, however, who knew there was a great scarcity of water in the castle, exulted in the idea that this additional number of warriors would soon exhaust the cisterns, and compel a surrender. Pulgar, hearing of this hope, caused a bucket of water to be lowered from the battlements, and threw a silver cup in bravado to the Moors. The garrison, in truth, suffered intensely from thirst, while to tantalize them in their sufferings, they beheld limpid streams winding in abundance through the green plain below them. They began to fear that all succor would arrive too late, when one day they beheld a little squadron of vessels far at sea, but standing toward the shore. There was some doubt at first whether it might not be a hostile armament from Africa, but as it approached they descried to their great joy the banner of Castile. It was a reinforcement brought in all haste by the governor of the fortress, Don Francisco Ramirez. The squadron anchored at a steep rocky island, which rises from the very margin of the smooth sandy beach directly in front of the rock of Salabrena, and stretches out into the sea. On this island, Ramirez landed his men, and was as strongly posted as if in a fortress. His force was too scanty to attempt a battle, but he assisted to harass and distract the besiegers whenever King Boabdil made an attack upon the fortress. His camp was assailed on one side by the troops of Ramirez, who landed from their island, and on another by those of Don Francisco Enriquez, who swept down from their rock, while Hernan del Pulgar kept up a brave defense from every tower and battlement of the castle. The attention of the Moorish king was diverted also for a time by an ineffectual attempt to relieve the little port of Adra, which had recently declared in his favor, but which had been recaptured for the Christians by Cid Hayya and his son Ulnayar. Thus, the unlucky Boabdil, bewildered on every hand, lost all the advantage that he had gained by his rapid march from Granada. While he was yet besieging the obstinate citadel, tidings were brought him that King Ferdinand was in full march with a powerful host to its assistance. There was no time for further delay. He made a furious attack with all his forces upon the castle, but was again repulsed by Pulgar and his coadjutors. When, abandoning the siege in despair, he retreated with his army, lest King Ferdinand should get between him and his capital on his way back to Granada. However, he in some sort consoled himself for his late disappointment by overrunning a part of the territories and possessions lately assigned to his uncle El Zagal, and to Cid Hayya. He defeated their alcaides, destroyed several of their fortresses, burnt their villages, and leaving the country behind him, reeking and smoking with his vengeance, returned with considerable booty to repose himself within the walls of the Alhambra. Pulgar Cron p. 3 Roman 100 Cura de los Palacios, cap 97. Chapter Roman 89, How King Ferdinand treated the people of Guadix, and how El Zagal finished his regal career. Scarcely had Boabdil XI ensconced himself in his capital, when King Ferdinand, at the head of 7,000 horse, and 20,000 foot again, appeared in the Vega. He had set out in all haste from Cordova to the relief of Salabrena. But hearing on his march that the siege was raised, he turned to make a second ravage round the walls of devoted Granada. His present forage lasted 15 days, in the course of which almost everything that had escaped his former desolating visit was destroyed, and scarce a green thing or a living animal was left on the face of the land. The Moors sallied frequently and fought desperately in defense of their fields, but the work of destruction was accomplished, and Granada, once the Queen of Gardens, was left surrounded by a desert. Ferdinand next hastened to crush a conspiracy in the cities of Guadix Baza and Almeria. These recently conquered places had entered into secret correspondence with Boabdil, inviting him to march to their gates, promising to rise upon the Christian garrisons, seize upon the citadels, and surrender them into his power. The Marks of Villena had received notice of the conspiracy, and suddenly thrown himself with a large force into Guadix, under pretense of a review of the inhabitants. He made them sally forth into the fields before the city. When the whole Moorish population capable of bearing arms was thus without the walls, he ordered the gates to be closed. He then permitted them to enter 2 by 2 and 3 by 3, and take forth their wives, children, and effects. The houseless Moors were fain to make themselves temporary hovels in the gardens and orchards about the city. They were clamorous in their complaints at being thus excluded from their homes, but were told they must wait with patience until the charges against them could be investigated, and the pleasure of the king be known. Zurita lib Roman 100 Cura de los Palacios, Roman 100. When Ferdinand arrived at Guadix, he found the unhappy Moors in their cabins among the orchards. They complained bitterly of the deception practiced upon them, and implored permission to return into the city and live peaceably in their dwellings, as had been promised them in their articles of capitulation. King Ferdinand listened graciously to their complaints. "My friend," said he in reply, "I have been informed that there has been a conspiracy among you to kill my alcaide and garrison, and to take part with my enemy, the King of Granada. I shall make a thorough investigation of this conspiracy. Those among you who shall be proved innocent shall be restored to their dwellings, but the guilty shall incur the penalty of their offenses, as I wish, however, to proceed with mercy, as well as justice. I now give you your choice, either to depart at once without further question, going wherever you please, and taking with you your families and effects under an assurance of safety, or to deliver up those who are guilty, not one of whom I give you my royal word shall escape punishment." When the people of Guadix heard these words, they communed among themselves, and as most of them, says the worthy Agapida, were either culpable or feared to be considered, so they accepted the alternative, and departed sorrowfully, they and their wives, and their little ones. Thus, in the words of that excellent and contemporary historian Andres Bernaldez, commonly called the curate of Los Palacios, this did the king deliver Guadix from the hands of the enemies of our holy faith, after 770 years that it had been in their possession, ever since the time of Roderick the Goth. And this was one of the mysteries of our Lord, who would not consent that the city should remain longer in the power of the Mursa pious and sage remark, which is quoted with peculiar approbation by the worthy Agapida. King Ferdinand offered similar alternatives to the Moors of Baza, Almeria, and other cities accused of participation in this conspiracy, who generally preferred to abandon their homes rather than incur the risk of an investigation. Most of them relinquished Spain as a country where they could no longer live in security and independence, and departed with their families for Africa. Such as remained were suffered to live in villages and hamlets and other unwalled places. Garibe lib 13 cap 39 Pulgar part 3 cap 132. While Ferdinand was thus occupied at Guadix, dispensing justice and mercy, and receiving cities in exchange, the old monarch, Muley Abdullah, surnamed El Zagal, appeared before him. He was haggard with care, and almost crazed with passion. He had found his little territory of Andarax, and his 2,000 subjects as difficult to govern as had been the distracted kingdom of Granada. The charm which had bound the Moors to him was broken when he appeared in arms under the banner of Ferdinand. He had returned from his inglorious campaign with his petty army of 200 men, followed by the execrations of the people of Granada, and the secret repining of those he had led into the field. No sooner had his subjects heard of the successes of Boabdil el Chico than they had seized their arms assembled, tumultuously declared for the young monarch, and threatened the life of El Zagal. The unfortunate old king had with difficulty evaded their fury, and this last lesson seemed entirely to have cured him of his passion for sovereignty. He now entreated Ferdinand to purchase the towns and castles and other possessions which had been granted to him, offering them at a low rate and begging safe passage for himself and his followers to Africa. King Ferdinand graciously complied with his wishes. He purchased of him 23 towns and villages in the valleys of Andarax and Olhoran, for which he gave him 5 millions of maravedis. El Zagal relinquished his right to one half of the Salinas or salt pits of Malaha in favor of his brother-in-law Cid Haya. Having thus disposed of his petty empire and possessions, he packed up all his treasure, of which he had a great amount, and followed by many Moorish families passed over to Africa. Cura de los Palacios, Cap 97. Condi Part 4, Cap 41. And here let us cast an eye beyond the present period of our chronicle, and trace the remaining career of El Zagal. His short and turbulent reign and disastrous end would afford a wholesome lesson to unprincipled ambition. Were not all ambition of the kind fated to be blind to precept and example when he arrived in Africa? Instead of meeting with kindness and sympathy, he was seized and thrown into prison by the Caliph of Fez Benimourin. As though he had been his vassal, he was accused of being the cause of the dissensions and downfall of the kingdom of Granada, and the accusation being proved to the satisfaction of the king of Fez, he condemned the unhappy El Zagal to perpetual darkness. A basin of glowing copper was passed before his eyes, which effectually destroyed his sight. His wealth, which had probably been the secret cause of these cruel measures, was confiscated and seized upon by his oppressor, and El Zagal was thrust forth blind, helpless, and destitute upon the world. In this wretched condition, the late Moorish monarch groped his way through the regions of Tingatania until he reached the city of Vélez de la Gomera. The emir of Vélez had formerly been his ally, and felt some movement of compassion at his present altered and abject state. He gave him food and raiment, and suffered him to remain unmolested in his dominions. Death, which so often hurries off the prosperous, and happy from the midst of untasted pleasures, spares on the other hand the miserable to drain the last drop of his cup of bitterness. El Zagal dragged out a wretched existence of many years in the city of Vélez. He wandered about blind and disconsolate, an object of mingled scorn and pity, and bearing above his raiment a parchment on which was written in Arabic, "This is the unfortunate king of Andalusia." Marmal de Ribiliani, Morlib 1, Cap 16, Pedraza Hist. Granad Part 3, Roman 100, Suarez, Hist, Obisp de Guadix y Baza, Cap 10. Chapter Roman 90, Preparations of Granada for a desperate defense. How is thy strength departed, O Granada? How is thy beauty withered and despoiled, O city of groves and fountains? The commerce that once thronged thy streets is at an end. The merchant no longer hastens to thy gates with the luxuries of foreign lands. The cities which once paid thee tribute are wrested from thy sway. The chivalry which filled thy vivarambla with sumptuous pageantry have fallen in many battles. The Alhambra still rears its ruddy towers from the midst of groves, but melancholy reigns in its marble halls, and the monarch looks down from his lofty balconies upon a naked waste where once extended the blooming glories of the Vega. Such is the lament of the Moorish writers over the lamentable state of Granada, now a mere phantom of former greatness. The two ravages of the Vega, following so closely upon each other, had swept off all the produce of the year, and the husbandman had no longer the heart to till the field, seeing the ripening harvest only brought the spoiler to his door. During the winter season, Ferdinand made diligent preparations for the campaign that was to decide the fate of Granada. As this war was waged purely for the promotion of the Christian faith, he thought it meet that its enemies should bear the expenses. He levied therefore a general contribution upon the Jews throughout his kingdom by synagogues and districts, and obliged them to render in the proceeds at the city of Seville. Garibe lib 18, Roman 100. On the 11th of April, Ferdinand and Isabella departed for the Moorish frontier with the solemn determination to lay close siege to Granada and never quit its walls until they had planted the standard of the faith on the towers of the Alhambra. Many of the nobles of the kingdom, particularly those from parts remote from the scene of action, wearied by the toils of war, and foreseeing that this would be a tedious siege requiring patience and vigilance rather than hardy deeds of arms, contented themselves with sending their vassals while they stayed at home to attend to their domains. Many cities furnished soldiers at their cost, and the king took the field with an army of 40,000 infantry and 10,000 horse. The principal captains who followed him in this campaign were Rodrigo Ponce de Leon, the Marks of Cadiz, the Master of Santiago, the Marks of Villena, the Counts of Tendilla, Cifuentes Cabra and Llerena, and Don Alonso de Aguilar. Queen Isabella, accompanied by her son the Prince Juan, and the princesses Juana Maria and Catalina, her daughters, proceeded to Alcala, La Real, the mountain fortress and stronghold of the Count de Tendilla. Here she remained to forward supplies to the army, and to be ready to repair to the camp, whenever her presence might be required. The army of Ferdinand poured into the Vega, by various defiles of the mountains, and on the 23rd of April, the royal tent was pitched at a village called Los Ojos de Huascar, about a league and a half from Granada. At the approach of this formidable force, the harassed inhabitants turned pale, and even many of the warriors trembled, for they felt that the last desperate struggle was at hand. Boabdil el Chico assembled his council in the Alhambra, from the windows of which they could behold the Christian squadrons, glistening through clouds of dust, as they poured along the Vega. The utmost confusion and consternation reigned in the council. Many of the members, terrified with the horrors impending over their families, advised Boabdil to throw himself upon the generosity of the Christian monarch. Even several of the bravest suggested the possibility of obtaining honorable terms. The Wazir of the city, Abul Qasim Abdul Melik, was called upon to report the state of the public means for sustenance and defense. There were sufficient provisions, he said, for a few months' supply, independent of what might exist in the possession of merchants and other rich inhabitants. But of what avail, said he, is a supply for a few months against the sieges of the Castilian monarch, which are interminable? He produced also the lists of men capable of bearing arms. The number, said he, is great, but what can be expected from mere citizen soldiers? They vaunt and menace in time of safety. None are so arrogant when the enemy is at a distance. But when the din of war thunders at the gates, they hide themselves in terror. When Musa heard these words, he rose with generous warmth. What reason have we, said he, to despair? The blood of those illustrious Moors, the conquerors of Spain, still flows in our veins. Let us be true to ourselves, and fortune will again be with us. We have a veteran force, both horse and foot, the flower of our chivalry, seasoned in war, and scarred in 1,000 battles. As to the multitude of our citizens spoken of so slightly, why should we doubt their valor? There are 20,000 young men in the fire of youth whom I will engage that in the defense of their homes they will rival the most valiant veterans. Do we want provisions? Our horses are fleet, and our horsemen daring in the foray. Let them scour and scourge the country of those apostate Moslems who have surrendered to the Christians. Let them make inroads into the lands of our enemies. We shall soon see them returning with cavalgadas to our gates. And to a soldier there is no morsel so sweet as that wrested with hard fighting from the foe. Boabdil, though he wanted firm and durable courage, was readily excited to sudden emotions of bravery. He caught a glow of resolution from the noble ardor of Musa. Do what is needful, said he to his commanders, into your hands. I confide the common safety. You are the protectors of the kingdom, and with the aid of Allah will revenge the insults of our religion, the deaths of our friends and relations, and the sorrows and sufferings heaped upon our land. Condi. To everyone was now assigned his separate duty. The Wazir had charge of the arms and provisions, and the enrolling of the people. Musa was to command the cavalry to defend the gates, and to take the lead in all sallies and skirmishings. Named Reduin and Muhammad ibn Zayd were his adjutants. Abdul Karim Zegri and the other captains were to guard the walls and the alcades of the Alcazaba, and of the Red Towers had command of the fortresses. Nothing now was heard but the din of arms and the bustle of preparation. The Moorish spirit, quick to catch fire, was immediately in a flame, and the populace, in the excitement of the moment, set at naught the power of the Christians. Musa was in all parts of the city infusing his own generous zeal into the bosoms of the soldiery. The young cavaliers rallied round him. As their model, the veteran warriors regarded him with a soldier's admiration. The vulgar throng followed him with shouts, and the helpless part of the inhabitants, the old men, and the women, hailed him with blessings as their protector. On the first appearance of the Christian army, the principal gates of the city had been closed and secured with bars and bolts and heavy chains. Musa now ordered them to be thrown open to me and my cavaliers. Said he has entrusted the defense of the gates, our bodies shall be their barriers. He stationed at each gate a strong guard chosen from his bravest men. His horsemen were always completely armed and ready to mount at a moment's warning. Their steeds stood saddled and caparisoned in the stables with lance and buckler beside them. On the least approach of the enemy, a squadron of horse gathered within the gate, ready to launch forth like the bolt from the thundercloud. Musa made no empty bravado nor haughty threat. He was more terrible in deeds than in words, and executed daring exploits beyond even the vaunt of the vainglorious. Such was the present champion of the Moors. Had they possessed many such warriors, or had Musa risen to power at an earlier period of the war, the fate of Granada might have been deferred, and the Moor for a long time have maintained his throne within the walls of the Alhambra. Chapter Roman 91: How King Ferdinand conducted the siege cautiously, and how Queen Isabella arrived at the camp. Though Granada was shorn of its glories, and nearly cut off from all external aid still, its mighty castles and massive bulwarks seemed to set all attack at defiance, being the last retreat of Moorish power it had assembled within its walls, the remnants of the armies which had contended step by step with the invaders in their gradual conquest of the land. All that remained of highborn and highbred chivalry was here. All that was loyal and patriotic was roused to activity by the common danger, and Granada, so long lulled into inaction by vain hopes of security, now assumed a formidable aspect in the hour of its despair. Ferdinand saw that any attempt to subdue the city by main force would be perilous and bloody. Cautious in his policy and fond of conquests gained by art rather than valor, he resorted to the plan so successful with Baza, and determined to reduce the place by famine. For this purpose, his armies penetrated into the very heart of the Alpuxerras, and ravaged the valleys, and sacked and burnt the towns upon which the city depended for its supplies. Scouting parties also ranged the mountains behind Granada, and captured every casual convoy of provisions. The Moors became more daring, as their situation became more hopeless. Never had Ferdinand experienced such vigorous sallies and assaults. Musa, at the head of his cavalry, harassed the borders of the camp, and even penetrated into the interior, making sudden spoil and ravage, and leaving his course to be traced by the slain and wounded. To protect his camp from these assaults, Ferdinand fortified it with deep trenches and strong bulwarks. It was of a quadrangular form, divided into streets like a city, the troops being quartered in tents, and in booths constructed of bushes and branches of trees. When it was completed, Queen Isabella came in state with all her court, and the prince and princesses to be present at the siege. This was intended, as on former occasions, to reduce the besieged to despair, by showing the determination of the sovereigns to reside in the camp until the city should surrender. Immediately after her arrival, the queen rode forth to survey the camp and its environs. Wherever she went, she was attended by a splendid retinue, and all the commanders vied with each other in the pomp and ceremony with which they received her. Nothing was heard from morning until night but shouts and acclamations and bursts of martial music, so that it appeared to the Moors as if a continual festival and triumph reigned in the Christian camp. The arrival of the queen, however, and the menaced obstinacy of the siege had no effect in damping the fire of the Moorish chivalry. Musa inspired the youthful warriors with the most devoted heroism. "We have nothing left to fight for," said he, "but the ground we stand on. When this is lost, we cease to have a country and a name." Finding the Christian king forbore to make an attack, Musa incited his cavaliers to challenge the youthful chivalry of the Christian army to single combat or partial skirmishes. Scarce a day passed without gallant conflicts of the kind in sight of the city, and the camp. The combatants rivaled each other in the splendor of their armor and array, as well as in the prowess of their deeds. Their contests were more like the stately ceremonials of tilts and tournaments than the rude conflicts of the field. Ferdinand soon perceived that they animated the fiery Moors with fresh zeal and courage, while they cost the lives of many of his bravest cavaliers. He again, therefore, forbade the acceptance of any individual challenges, and ordered that all partial encounters should be avoided. The cool and stern policy of the Catholic sovereign bore hard upon the generous spirits of either army, but roused the indignation of the Moors when they found that they were to be subdued in this inglorious manner. "Of what avail," said they, "are chivalry and heroic valor? The crafty monarch of the Christians has no magnanimity in warfare. He seeks to subdue us through the weakness of our bodies, but shuns to encounter the courage of our souls." Chapter Roman 92: Of the insolent defiance of Tarf the Moor, and the daring exploit of Hernan Perez del Pulgar. When the Moorish knights beheld that all courteous challenges were unavailing, they sought various means to provoke the Christian warriors to the field. Sometimes a body of them, fleetly mounted, would gallop up to the skirts of the camp and try who should hurl his lance farthest within the barriers, having his name inscribed upon it, or a label affixed containing some taunting defiance. These bravadoes caused great irritation. Still, the Spanish warriors were restrained by the prohibition of the king. Among the Moorish cavaliers was one named Tarf, renowned for strength and daring spirit, but whose courage partook of fierce audacity rather than chivalric heroism. In one of these sallies, when skirting the Christian camp, this arrogant Moor outstripped his companions, overleaped the barriers, and galloping close to the royal quarters launched his lance so far within that it remained quivering in the earth close by the pavilions of the sovereigns. The royal guards rushed forth in pursuit, but the Moorish horsemen were already beyond the camp, and scouring in a cloud of dust for the city upon wresting the lance from the earth. A label was found upon it, importing that it was intended for the queen. Nothing could equal the indignation of the Christian warriors at the insolence of the bravado and the discourteous insult offered to the Queen. Hernan Perez del Pulgar, surnamed he of the exploits, was present, and resolved not to be outbraved by this daring infidel. Who will stand by me, said he, in an enterprise of desperate peril. The Christian cavaliers well knew the harebrained valor of Hernan, yet not one hesitated to step forward. He chose 15 companions, all of powerful arm and dauntless heart. His project was to penetrate Granada in the dead of the night, by a secret pass made known to him by a Moorish renegade of the city whom he had christened Pedro Pulgar, and who was to act as guide. They were to set fire to the Alcáceria and other principal edifices, and then effect their retreat as best they might. At the hour appointed, the adventurous troops set forth, provided with combustibles. The renegade led them silently to a drain or channel of the river Darro, up which they proceeded cautiously single file, until they halted under a bridge near the royal gate. Here, dismounting, Pulgar stationed 6 of his companions to remain silent and motionless, and keep guard while followed by the rest and still guided by the renegade. He continued up the drain or channel of the Darro, which passes under a part of the city, and was thus enabled to make his way undiscovered into the streets. All was dark and silent at the command of Pulgar. The renegade led him to the principal mosque. Here the cavalier, pious as brave, threw himself on his knees, and drawing forth a parchment scroll, on which was inscribed in large letters, Ave Maria, nailed it to the door of the mosque, thus converting the heathen edifice into a Christian chapel, and dedicating it to the Blessed Virgin. This done, he hastened to the Alcáceria to set it in a blaze. The combustibles were all placed, but Tristan de Montemayor, who had charge of the firebrand, had carelessly left it at the door of the mosque. It was too late to return there. Pulgar was endeavoring to strike fire with flint and steel into the raveled end of a cord, when he was startled by the approach of the Moorish guards. Going the rounds, his hand was on his sword. In an instant, seconded by his brave companions, he assailed the astonished Moors, and put them to flight. In a little while, the whole city resounded with alarm. Soldiers were hurrying through the streets in every direction, but Pulgar, guided by the renegade, made good his retreat by the channel of the Darro to his companions at the bridge, and all mounting their horses spurred back to the camp. The Moors were at a loss to imagine the meaning of this wild and apparently fruitless assault, but great was their exasperation on the following day, when the trophy of hardihood and prowess, the Ave Maria, was discovered, thus elevated in bravado in the very center of the city. The mosque, thus boldly sanctified by Hernan del Pulgar, was actually consecrated into a cathedral after the capture of Granada. The account here given of the exploit of Hernan del Pulgar differs from that given in the first edition, and is conformable to the record of the fact in a manuscript called the House of Salar, existing in the Library of Salazar, and cited by Alcantara in his History of Granada. In commemoration of this daring feat of Pulgar, the Emperor Charles Roman V in after years conferred on that cavalier, and on his descendants the Marquesses of Salar, the privilege of sitting in the choir during High Mass, and assigned as the place of sepulture of Pulgar himself the identical spot where he kneeled to affix the sacred scroll, and his tomb is still held in great veneration. This Hernan Perez del Pulgar was a man of letters as well as art, and inscribed to Charles Roman V a summary of the achievements of Gonsalvo of Cordova, surnamed the Great Captain, who had been one of his comrades in arms. He is often confounded with Hernando del Pulgar, historian and secretary to Queen Isabella. See note to Pulgar's Chron of the Catholic Sovereigns, Part 3, Roman 100, Roman 3, edit Valencia, 1780. Chapter Roman 93, How Queen Isabella took a view of the city of Granada, and how her curiosity cost the lives of many Christians and Moors. The royal encampment lay so distant from Granada that the general aspect of the city only could be seen, as it rose gracefully from the Vega, covering the sides of the hills, with palaces and towers. Queen Isabella had expressed an earnest desire to behold nearer at hand a city whose beauty was so renowned throughout the world, and the Marquess of Cadiz, with his accustomed courtesy, prepared a great military escort and guard to protect her, and the ladies of the court, while they enjoyed this perilous gratification. On the morning of June the 18th, a magnificent and powerful train, issued from the Christian camp. The advance guard was composed of legions of cavalry, heavily armed, looking like moving masses of polished steel. Then came the king and queen with the prince and princess, and the ladies of the court surrounded by the royal bodyguard sumptuously arrayed composed of the sons of the most illustrious houses of Spain. After these was the rearguard. Powerful force of horse and foot for the flower of the army, sallied forth that day. The Moors gazed with fearful admiration at this glorious pageant, wherein the pomp of the court was mingled with the terrors of the camp. It moved along in radiant line across the Vega to the melodious thunders of martial music, while banner and plume and silken scarf and rich brocade gave a gay and gorgeous relief to the grim visage of iron war that lurked beneath. The army moved toward the hamlet of Zubia, built on the skirts of the mountain to the left of Granada, and commanding a view of the Alhambra and the most beautiful quarter of the city. As they approached the hamlet, the Marks of Villena, the Count Urena and Don Alonso de Aguilar fled off with their battalions and were soon seen glittering along the side of the mountain above the village. In the meantime, the Marks of Cadiz, the Count de Tendilla, the Count de Cabra, and Don Alonso Fernandez, senior of Alcadret and Montemayor, drew up their forces in battle array on the plain below the hamlet, presenting a living barrier of loyal chivalry between the sovereigns and the city. Thus securely guarded, the royal party alighted, and entering one of the houses of the hamlet, which had been prepared for their reception, enjoyed a full view of the city from its terraced roof. The ladies of the court gazed with delight at the red towers of the Alhambra, rising from amid shady groves, anticipating the time when the Catholic sovereigns should be enthroned within its walls. And its courts shine with the splendor of Spanish chivalry. The reverend prelates and holy friars, who always surrounded the queen, looked with serene satisfaction, says Fray Antonio Agapida, at this modern Babylon, enjoying the triumph that awaited them when those mosques and minarets should be converted into churches, and goodly priests and bishops should succeed to the infidel alfaquies. When the Moors beheld the Christians thus drawn forth in full array in the plain, they supposed it was to offer battle, and hesitated not to accept it. In a little while the queen beheld a body of Moorish cavalry pouring into the Vega, the riders managing their fleet and fiery steeds. With admirable address, they were richly armed and clothed in the most brilliant colors, and the caparisons of their steeds flamed with gold and embroidery. This was the favorite squadron of Musa, composed of the flower of the youthful cavaliers of Granada. Others succeeded, some heavily armed, others a la Ginetta, with lance and buckler. And lastly came the legions of foot soldiers with arquebuse and crossbow and spear and cimeter. When the queen saw this army issuing from the city, she sent to the Marks of Cadiz and forbade any attack upon the enemy or the acceptance of any challenge to a skirmish, for she was loth that her curiosity should cost the life of a single human being. The Marks promised to obey, though sorely against his will, and it grieved the spirit of the Spanish cavaliers to be obliged to remain with sheathed swords, while bearded by the foe. The Moors could not comprehend the meaning of this inaction of the Christians. After having apparently invited a battle, they sallied several times from their ranks and approached near enough to discharge their arrows. But the Christians were immovable. Many of the Moorish horsemen galloped close to the Christian ranks, brandishing their lances and cimeters, and defying various cavaliers to single combat. But Ferdinand had rigorously prohibited all duels of the kind, and they dared not transgress his orders under his very eye. Here, however, the worthy Fray Antonio Agapida, in his enthusiasm for the triumphs of the faith, records the following incident, which we fear is not sustained by any grave chronicler of the times, but rests merely on tradition or the authority of certain poets and dramatic writers who have perpetuated the tradition in their works. While this grim and reluctant tranquility prevailed along the Christian line, says Agapida, there rose a mingled shout and sound of laughter near the gate of the city. A Moorish horseman, armed at all points, issued forth, followed by a rabble who drew back as he approached the scene of danger. The Moor was more robust and brawny than was common with his countrymen. His visor was closed. He bore a huge buckler and a ponderous lance. His cimeter was of a Damascus blade, and his richly ornamented dagger was wrought by an artificer of Fez. He was known by his device to be Tarf, the most insolent yet valiant of the Moslem warriors, same who had hurled into the royal camp his lance, inscribed to the queen. As he rode slowly along in front of the army, his very steed, prancing with fiery eye and distended nostril, seemed to breathe defiance to the Christians. But what were the feelings of the Spanish cavaliers when they beheld, tied to the tail of his steed and dragged in the dust, the very inscription of Mariojich Hernan Perez del Pulgar had affixed to the door of the mosque? a burst of horror and indignation broke forth from the army. Hernan was not at hand to maintain his previous achievement, but one of his young companions in arms, Garcilaso de la Vega by name, putting spurs to his horse, galloped to the hamlet of Zubia, threw himself on his knees before the king, and besought permission to accept the defiance of this insolent infidel, and to revenge the insult offered to our blessed lady. The request was too pious to be refused. Garcilaso remounted his steed, closed his helmet graced by 4 sable plumes, grasped his buckler of Flemish workmanship, and his lance of matchless temper, and defied the haughty Moor in the midst of his career. A combat took place in view of the two armies, and of the Castilian court, the Moor was powerful in wielding weapons and dexterous in managing his steed. He was of larger frame than Garcilaso, and more completely armed, and the Christians trembled for their champion. The shock of their encounter was dreadful, their lances were shivered, and sent up splinters in the air. Garcilaso was thrown back in his saddle, his horse made a wide career before he could recover, gather up the reins, and return to the conflict. They now encountered each other with swords. The Moor circled round his opponent as a hawk circles, were about to make a swoop. His steed obeyed his rider with matchless quickness. At every attack of the infidel, it seemed as if the Christian knight must sink beneath his flashing cimeter. But if Garcilaso was inferior to him, in power he was superior in agility. Many of his blows he parried, others he received upon his Flemish shield, which was proof against the Damascus blade. The blood streamed from numerous wounds, received by either warrior. The Moor, seeing his antagonist exhausted, availed himself of his superior force and grappling, endeavored to wrest him from his saddle. They both fell to earth. The Moor placed his knee upon the breast of his victim, and brandishing his dagger, aimed a blow at his throat. A cry of despair was uttered by the Christian warriors, when suddenly they beheld the Moor rolling lifeless in the dust. Garcilaso had shortened his sword, and as his adversary raised his arm to strike, had pierced him to the heart. It was a singular and miraculous victory, says Fray Antonio Agapida. But the Christian knight was armed by the sacred nature of his cause, and the Holy Virgin gave him strength like another David to slay this gigantic champion of the Gentiles. The laws of chivalry were observed throughout the combatno. One interfered on either side. Garcilaso now despoiled his adversary. Then, rescuing the holy inscription of Ave Maria from its degrading situation, he elevated it on the point of his sword, and bore it on as a signal of triumph amid the rapturous shouts of the Christian army. The above incident has been commemorated in old Spanish ballads, and made the subject of a scene in an old Spanish drama ascribed by some to Lope de Vega. The sun had now reached the meridian, and the hot blood of the Moors was inflamed by its rays, and by the sight of the defeat of their champion Musa, ordered 2 pieces of ordnance to open a fire upon the Christians. A confusion was produced in one part of their ranks. Musa called to the chiefs of the army, "Let us waste no more time in empty challenges, let us charge upon the enemy. He who assaults has always an advantage in the combat." So saying, he rushed forward, followed by a large body of horse and foot, and charged so furiously upon the advance guard of the Christians that he drove it in upon the battalion of the Marks of Cadiz. The gallant Marks now considered himself absolved from all further obedience to the Queen's commands. He gave the signal to attack. Santiago was shouted along the line, and he pressed forward to the encounter with his battalion of 1,200 lances. The other cavaliers followed his example, and the battle instantly became general. When the king and queen beheld the armies thus rushing to the combat, they threw themselves on their knees and implored the Holy Virgin to protect her faithful warriors, the prince and princess, the ladies of the court, and the prelates and friars who were present did the same, and the effect of the prayers of these illustrious and saintly persons was immediately apparent. The fierceness with which the Moors had rushed to the attack was suddenly cooled. They were bold and adroit for a skirmish, but unequal to the veteran Spaniards. In the open field, a panic seized upon the foot soldiers. They turned and took to flight. Musa and his cavaliers in vain endeavored to rally them. Some took refuge in the mountains, but the greater part fled to the city in such confusion that they overturned and trampled upon each other. The Christians pursued them to the very gates. Upward of 2,000 were either killed, wounded, or taken prisoners, and the 2 pieces of ordnance were brought off as trophies of the victory. Not a Christian lance, but was bathed that day in the blood of an infidel. Cura de los Palacios, cap. 101, Zurita lib. 20 Roman 100. Such was the brief but bloody action, which was known among the Christian warriors by the name of the Queen's Skirmish. for when the marks of Cadiz waited upon Her Majesty to apologize for breaking her commands, he attributed the victory entirely to her presence. The Queen, however, insisted that it was all owing to her troops being led on by so valiant a commander. Her Majesty had not yet recovered from her agitation at beholding so terrible a scene of bloodshed, though certain veterans present pronounced it as gay and gentle a skirmish as they had ever witnessed. The gaiety of this gentle pass at arms, however, was somewhat marred by a rough reverse in the evening certain of the Christian cavaliers, among whom were the Count de Urena Don Alonso Aguilar, his brother Gonsalvo of Cordova, Diego Castrillo, commander of Calatrava, and others to the number of 50, remained in ambush near Armilla, expecting the Moors would sally forth at night to visit the scene of battle and to bury their dead. They were discovered by a Moor who had climbed an elm tree to reconnoiter, and who hastened into the city to give notice of their ambush. Scarce had night fallen, when the cavaliers found themselves surrounded by a host, which in the darkness seemed innumerable. The Moors attacked them with sanguinary fury to revenge the disgrace of the morning. The cavaliers fought to every disadvantage, overwhelmed by numbers, ignorant of the ground, perplexed by thickets, and by the watercourses of the gardens, the sluices of which were all thrown open. Even retreat was difficult. The Count de Urena was surrounded, and in imminent peril, from which he was saved by two of his faithful followers at the sacrifice of their lives. Several cavaliers lost their horses, and were themselves put to death in the watercourses. Gonsalvo of Cordova came near having his own illustrious career cut short in this obscure skirmish. He had fallen into a watercourse, whence he extricated himself covered with mud, and so encumbered with his armor that he could not retreat. Inigo de Mendoza, a relative of his brother Alonso, seeing his peril, offered him his horse. Take it, Senor, said he, for you cannot save yourself on foot, and I can, but should I fall, take care of my wife and daughters. Gonsalvo accepted the devoted offer, mounted the horse, and had made but few paces when a lamentable cry caused him to turn his head, and he beheld the faithful Mendoza, transfixed by Moorish lances. The four principal cavaliers, already named, with several of their followers, effected their retreat and reached the camp in safety. But this nocturnal reverse obscured the morning's triumph. Gonsalvo remembered the last words of the devoted Mendoza, and bestowed a pension on his widow and marriage portions on his daughters. The account of this nocturnal affair is from Peter Martyr, lib 4. Epist 90 and Pulgar Hazanas del Gran Capitan, page 188, as cited by Alcantara Hist. Granada, tom 4, cap 18. To commemorate the victory of which she had been an eyewitness, Queen Isabella afterward erected a monastery in the village of Zubia, dedicated to St. Francisco, which still exists, and in its garden is a laurel planted by her hands. The house whence the king and queen contemplated the battle is likewise to be seen at the present day. It is in the first street to the right on entering the village from the Vega, and the royal arms are painted on the ceilings. It is inhabited by a worthy farmer, Francisque Garcia, who, in showing the house to the writer, refused all compensation, with true Spanish pride, offering on the contrary the hospitalities of his mansion. His children are versed in the old Spanish ballads about the exploits of Hernan Perez del Pulgar and Garcilaso de la Vega. Chapter Roman 94, the last ravage before Granada. The ravages of war had as yet spared a little portion of the Vega of Granada. A green belt of gardens and orchards still flourished round the city, extending along the banks of the Zenil and the Darro. They had been the solace and delight of the inhabitants in their happier days, and contributed to their sustenance in this time of scarcity. Ferdinand determined to make a final and exterminating ravage to the very walls of the city, so that there should not remain a single green thing for the sustenance of man or beast. The 8th of July was the day appointed for this act of desolation. Boabdil was informed by his spies of the intention of the Christian king, and prepared to make a desperate defense. Hernando de Biza, a Christian who resided with the royal family in the Alhambra, as interpreter, gives in a manuscript memoir an account of the parting of Boabdil from his family, as he went forth to battle at an early hour on the appointed day, the 8th of July. He bathed and perfumed himself, as the Moors of high rank were accustomed to do when they went forth to peril their lives arrayed in complete armor. He took leave of his mother, his wife, and his sister in the antechamber of the Tower of Comers. Ixalahora, with her usual dignity, bestowed on him her benediction, and gave him her hand to kiss. It was a harder parting with his son and his daughter, who hung round him with sobs and tears. The Dunas and Dincellas, two of the royal household, made the halls of the Alhambra resound with their lamentations. He then mounted his horse and put himself in front of his squadrons. Hernando de Beza, as cited by Alcantara, hissed, Grand T4 Roman 100. The Christian army approached close to the city, and were laying waste the gardens and orchards, when Boabdil sallied forth, surrounded by all that was left of the flower and chivalry of Granada. There is one place where even the coward becomes brave, that sacred spot. Called home? What then must have been the valor of the Moors, a people always of chivalrous spirit, when the war was thus brought? To their thresholds they fought among the scenes of their loves and pleasures, the scenes of their infancy, and the haunts of their domestic life. They fought under the eyes of their wives. And children, their old men, and their maidensoft, all that was helpless, and all that was dear to them, for all Granada crowded on tower and battlement, watched with trembling heart the fate of this eventful day. There was not so much one battle as a variety of battles. Every garden and orchard became a scene of deadly contest. Every inch of ground was disputed with an agony of grief and valor. By the Moors, every inch of ground that the Christians advanced they valiantly maintained, but never did they advance with severe fighting or greater loss of blood. The cavalry of Musa was in every part of the field. Wherever it came, it gave fresh ardor to the fight. The Moorish soldier, fainting with heat, fatigue, and wounds, was roused to new life at the approach of Musa, and even he who lay gasping in the agonies of death turned his face toward him, and faintly uttered cheers and blessings as he passed. The Christians had by this time gained possession of various towers near the city, whence they had been annoyed by crossbows and arquebuses. The Moors, scattered in various actions, were severely pressed. Boabdil, at the head of the cavaliers of his guard, mingling in the fight in various parts of the field, endeavored to inspirit the foot soldiers to the combat. But the Moorish infantry was never to be depended upon in the heat of the action. A panic seized upon them. They fled, leaving their sovereign exposed with his handful of cavaliers to an overwhelming force. Boabdil was on the point of falling into the hands of the Christians, when wheeling round he and his followers threw the reins on the necks of their steeds, and took refuge by dint of hoof within the walls of the city. Zurita, lib 20 Roman 100. Musa endeavored to retrieve the fortune of the field. He threw himself before the retreating infantry, calling upon them to turn and fight for their homes, their families, for everything sacred and dear to them. All in vain, totally broken and dismayed, they fled tumultuously for the gates. Musa would fain have kept the field with his cavalry, but this devoted band, having stood the brunt of war throughout this desperate campaign, was fearfully reduced in numbers, and many of the survivors were crippled and enfeebled by their wounds. Slowly and reluctantly, therefore, he retreated to the city, his bosom swelling with indignation and despair. Entering the gates, he ordered them to be closed and secured with bolts and bars, for he refused to place any further confidence in the archers and arquebusiers stationed to defend them, and vowed never more to sally with foot soldiers to the field. In the meantime, the artillery thundered from the walls and checked all further advance of the Christians. King Ferdinand therefore called off his troops and returned in triumph to his camp, leaving the beautiful city of Granada wrapped in the smoke of her fields and gardens, and surrounded by the bodies of her slaughtered children. Such was the last sally of the Moors in defense of their favorite city. The French ambassador who witnessed it was filled with wonder at the prowess, the dexterity, and the daring of the Moslems. In truth, this whole war was an instance memorable in history of the most persevering resolution. For nearly 10 years had the war endured an almost uninterrupted series of disasters to the Moorish arms. Their towns had been taken one after another, and their brethren slain or led into captivity. Yet they disputed every city and town and fortress, and castle, nay, every rock itself, as if they had been inspirited by victories. Wherever they could plant foot to fight or find wall or cliff whence to launch an arrow, they disputed their beloved country. And now, when their capital was cut off from all relief and a whole nation thundered at its gates, they still maintained defense, as if they hoped some miracle to interpose in their behalf. Their obstinate resistance, says an ancient chronicler, shows the grief with which they yielded up the Vega, which was to them a paradise, and heaven. Exerting all the strength of their arms, they embraced, as it were, that most beloved soil from which neither wounds nor defeats nor death itself could part them. They stood firm, battling for it with the united force of love and grief, never drawing back the foot while they had hands to fight or fortune to befriend them. Abarca raised to Aragon, R30 Roman 100. Chapter Roman 95, Conflagration of the Christian Camp Building of Santa Fe. The Moors now shut themselves up gloomily within their walls. There were no longer any daring sallies from their gates, and even the martial clangor of the drum and trumpet, which had continually resounded within the warrior city, was now seldom heard from its battlements. In the midst of this deep despondency, a single disaster in the Christian camp, for a moment, lit up a ray of hope in the bosom of the Moors. The setting sun of a hot summer's day on the 10th of July shone splendidly upon the Christian camp, which was in a bustle of preparation for the next day's service. When an attack was meditated on the city, the camp made a glorious appearance. The various tents of the royal family and the attendant nobles were adorned with rich hangings and sumptuous devices, and costly furniture forming, as it were, a little city of silk and brocade, where the pinnacles of pavilions of various gay colors, surmounted with waving standards and fluttering pennons, might vie with the domes and minarets of the capital they were besieging. In the midst of this little gaudy metropolis, the lofty tent of the queen domineered over the rest like a stately palace. The Marks of Cadiz had courteously surrendered his own tent to the queen. It was the most complete and sumptuous in Christendom, and had been carried about with him throughout the war. In the center rose a stately alfanec, or pavilion in oriental taste, the rich hangings being supported by columns of lances, and ornamented with martial devices. This central pavilion, or silken tower, was surrounded by other compartments, some of painted linen, lined with silk, and all separated from each other by curtains. It was one of those camp palaces which are raised and demolished in an instant, like the city of canvas which surrounds them. As the evening advanced, the bustle in the camp subsided. Every one sought repose preparatory to the next day's trial. The king retired early that he might be up with the crowing of the cock to head the destroying army in person. All stir of military preparation was hushed in the royal quarters. The very sound of minstrelsy was mute, and not the tinkling of a guitar was to be heard from the tents of the fair ladies of the court. The queen had retired to the innermost part of her pavilion, where she was performing her orisons before a private altar. Perhaps the peril to which the king might be exposed in the next days foray inspired her with more than usual devotion. While thus at her prayers, she was suddenly aroused by a glare of light and wreaths of suffocating smoke. In an instant the whole tent was in a blaze. There was a high gusty wind, which whirled the light flames from tent to tent, and wrapped the whole in one conflagration. Isabella had barely time to save herself by instant flight. Her first thought on being extricated from her tent was for the safety of the king. She rushed to his tent, but the vigilant Ferdinand was already at the entrance of it. Starting from bed on the first alarm, and fancying it an assault of the enemy, he had seized his sword and buckler, and sallied forth, undressed, with his cuirass upon his arm. The late gorgeous camp was now a scene of wild confusion. The flames kept spreading from one pavilion to another, glaring upon the rich armor and golden and silver vessels, which seemed melting in the fervent heat. Many of the soldiers had erected booths and bowers of branches, which being dry crackled and blazed. And added to the rapid conflagration, the ladies of the court fled shrieking and half-dressed from their tents. There was an alarm of drum and trumpet, and a distracted hurry about the camp of men. Half-armed, the Prince Juan had been snatched out of bed by an attendant, and conveyed to the quarters of the Count de Cabra, which were at the entrance of the camp. The loyal count immediately summoned his people, and those of his cousin Don Alonso de Montemayor, and formed a guard round the tent in which the prince was sheltered. The idea that this was a stratagem of the Moors soon subsided, but it was feared they might take advantage of it to assault the camp. The Marks of Cadiz therefore sallied forth with 3,000 horse to check any advance from the city. As they passed along, the whole camp was a scene of hurry and consternation, some hastening to their posts at the call of drum and trumpet, some attempting to save rich effects and glittering armor from the tents, others dragging along terrified and restive horses. When they emerged from the camp, they found the whole firmament illuminated. The flames whirled up in long light spires, and the air was filled with sparks and cinders. A bright glare was thrown upon the city, revealing every battlement and tower. Turbaned heads were seen gazing from every roof, and armor gleamed along the walls, yet not a single warrior sallied from the gates. The Moors suspected some stratagem on the part of the Christians, and kept quietly within their walls. By degrees, the flames expired, the city faded from sight, all again became dark and quiet, and the Marks of Cadiz returned with his cavalry to the camp. When the day dawned on the Christian camp, nothing remained of that beautiful assemblage of stately pavilions, but heaps of smoldering rubbish with helms and corslets, and other furniture of war, and masses of melted gold and silver glittering. Among the ashes, the wardrobe of the queen was entirely destroyed, and there was an immense loss in plate, jewels, costly stuffs, and sumptuous armor of the luxurious nobles. The fire at first had been attributed to treachery, But on investigation, it proved to be entirely accidental. The queen, on retiring to her prayers, had ordered her lady in attendance to remove a light burning near her couch, lest it should prevent her sleeping through heedlessness. The taper was placed in another part of the tent, near the hangings, which being blown against it by a gust of wind, immediately took fire. The wary Ferdinand knew the sanguine temperament of the Moors, and hastened to prevent their deriving confidence from the night's disaster at break of day. The drums and trumpets sounded to arms, and the Christian army issued forth from among the smoking ruins of their camp, in shining squadrons, with flaunting banners and bursts of martial melody, as though the preceding night had been a time of high festivity, instead of terror. The Moors had beheld the conflagration with wonder and perplexity, when the day broke, and they looked toward the Christian camp. They saw nothing but a dark smoking mass. Their scouts came in, with the joyful intelligence that the whole camp was a scene of ruin. In the exultation of the moment, they flattered themselves with hopes that the catastrophe would discourage the besiegers, that, as in former years, their invasion would end with the summer, and they would withdraw before the autumnal rains. The measures of Ferdinand and Isabella soon crushed these hopes. They gave orders to build a regular city upon the site of their camp, to convince the Moors that the siege was to endure until the surrender of Granada. 9 of the principal cities of Spain were charged with the stupendous undertaking, and they emulated each other with a zeal worthy of the cause. It verily seems, says Fray Antonio Agapida, as though some miracle operated to aid this pious work. So rapidly did arise a formidable city, with solid edifices and powerful walls and mighty towers where lately had been seen nothing but tents and light pavilions. The city was traversed by 2 principal streets, in form of a cross terminating in 4 gates facing the 4 winds, and in the center was a vast square where the whole army might be assembled to this city. It was proposed to give the name of Isabella, so dear to the army and the nation. But that pious princess, adds Antonio Agapida, calling to mind the holy cause in which it was erected, gave it the name of Santa Fe, or the City of the Holy Faith, and it remains to this day a monument of the piety and glory of the Catholic sovereigns. Hither the merchants soon resorted from all points. Long trains of mules were seen every day entering and departing from its gates. The streets were crowded with magazines filled with all kinds of costly and luxurious merchandise. A scene of bustling commerce and prosperity took place, while unhappy Granada remained shut up and desolate. Chapter Roman 96. Famine and discord in the city. The besieged city now began to suffer the distress of famine. Its supplies were all cut off. A cavalcada of flocks and herds and mules, laden with money, coming to the relief of the city, from the mountains of the Alpuxerras, was taken by the marks of Cadiz, and led in triumph to the camp. In sight of the suffering Moors, autumn arrived, but the harvests had been swept from the face of the country. A rigorous winter was approaching, and the city was almost destitute of provisions. The people sank into deep despondency. They called to mind all that had been predicted by astrologers at the birth of their ill-starred sovereign, and all that had been foretold of the fate of Granada at the time of the capture of Zahara. Boabdil was alarmed by the gathering dangers from without, and by the clamors of his starving people. He summoned a council, composed of the principal officers of the army, the alcaides of the fortresses, the zequis or sages of the city, and the alfaquis or doctors of the faith. They assembled in the great hall of audience of the Alhambra, and despair was painted in their countenances. Boabdil demanded of them what was to be done in the present extremity, and their answer was surrender. The venerable Abul Qasim, governor of the city, represented its unhappy state. Our granaries are nearly exhausted, and no further supplies are to be expected. The provender for the war horses is required as sustenance for the soldiery. The very horses themselves are killed for food of 7,000 steeds, which once could be sent into the field. 300 only remain. Our city contains 200,000 inhabitants, old and young, with each a mouth that calls piteously for bread. The zequis and principal citizens declared that the people could no longer sustain the labors and sufferings of a defense. And of what avail is our defense, said they, when the enemy is determined to persist in the siege? What alternative remains but to surrender or to die? The heart of Boabdil was touched by this appeal, and he maintained a gloomy silence. He had cherished some faint hope of relief from the Sultan of Egypt or the Barbary powers, but it was now at an end. Even if such assistance were to be sent, he had no longer a seaport where it might debark. The councillors saw that the resolution of the king was shaken, and they united their voices in urging him to capitulate. Musa alone rose in opposition. It is yet too early, said he, to talk of surrender. Our means are not exhausted. we have yet one source of strength remaining terrible in its effects, and which often has achieved the most signal victorious. It is our despair. Let us rouse the mass of the people, let us put weapons in their hands, let us fight the enemy to the very utmost, until we rush upon the points of their lances. I am ready to lead the way into the thickest of their squadrons, and much rather would I be numbered among those who fell in the defense of Granada than of those who survived to capitulate for her surrender. The words of Musa were without effect, for they were addressed to broken-spirited and heartless men, or men, perhaps to whom sad experience had taught discretion. They were arrived at that state of public depression, when heroes and heroism are no longer regarded, and when old men and their councils rise into importance. Boabdil el Chico yielded to the general voice. It was determined to capitulate with the Christian sovereigns, and the venerable Abul Qasim was sent forth to the camp, empowered to treat for terms. Chapter Roman Capitulation of Granada. The old governor Abul Qasim was received with great courtesy by Ferdinand and Isabella, who, being informed of the purport of his embassy, granted the besieged a truce of 60 days from the 5th of October, and appointed Gonsalvo of Cordova and Hernando de Zafra, the secretary of the king, to treat about the terms of surrender with such commissioners as might be named by Boabdil. The latter, on his part, named Abul Qasim Aben Comixa the vizier, and the grand caddy as a pledge of good faith. Boabdil gave his son in hostage, who was taken to Mauchline, where he was treated with the greatest respect and attention by the good Count de Tendilla, as general of the frontier. The commissioners on both parts held repeated conferences in secret in the dead of the night, at the village of Churiana, those who first arrived at the place of meeting, giving notice to the others by signal fires, or by means of spies. After many debates and much difficulty, the capitulation was signed on the 25th of November. According to this, the city was to be delivered up with all its gates, towers, and fortresses within 60 days. All Christian captives should be liberated without ransom. Boabdil and his principal cavaliers should perform the act of homage and take an oath of fealty to the Castilian crown. The Moors of Granada should become subjects of the Spanish sovereigns, retaining their possessions, their arms and horses, and yielding up nothing, but their artillery. They should be protected in the exercise of their religion, and governed by their own laws administered by caddies of their own faith under governors appointed by the sovereigns. They should be exempted from tribute for 3 years, after which term they should pay the same that they had been accustomed to render to their native monarchs. Those who chose to depart for Africa within 3 years should be provided with a passage for themselves, and their effects free of charge from whatever port they should prefer. For the fulfillment of these articles, 500 hostages from the principal families were required previous to the surrender, who should be treated with great respect and distinction by the Christians, and subsequently restored. The son of the King of Granada and all other hostages in possession of the Castilian sovereigns were to be restored at the same time. Such are the main articles affecting the public weal, which were agreed upon after much discussion by the mixed commission. There were other articles, however secretly arranged, which concerned the royal family. These secured to Boabdil to his wife, Morima his mother, Isa his brothers, and to Zorka, the widow of Muli Abul, Hassan all the landed possessions, houses, mills, baths, and other hereditaments which formed the royal patrimony, with the power of selling them personally or by agent at any and all times to Boabdil, was secured. Moreover, his wealthy estates both in and out of Granada, and to him and his descendants in perpetuity, the lordships of various town and lands and fertile valleys in the Alpuxerras, forming a petty sovereignty, in addition to all which it was stipulated that on the day of surrender he should receive 30,000 castellanos of gold. Alcantara T4 Roman 100. The conditions of surrender being finally agreed upon by the commissioners Abul Qasim, proceeded to the royal camp at Santa Fe, where they were signed by Ferdinand and Isabella. He then returned to Granada, accompanied by Hernando de Zafra, the royal secretary, to have the same ratified also by the Moorish king. Boabdil assembled his council, and with a dejected countenance laid before it the articles of capitulation, as the best that could be obtained from the besieging foe. When the members of the council found the awful moment arrived when they were to sign and seal the perdition of their empire, and blot themselves out as a nation, all firmness deserted them, and many gave way to tears. Musa alone retained an unaltered mien. Leave seniors cried, he this idle lamentation to helpless women and children. We are men, we have hearts not to shed tender tears, but drops of blood. I see the spirit of the people so cast down that it is impossible to save the kingdom, Yet there still remains an alternative for noble minds, a glorious death. Let us die defending our liberty, and avenging the woes of Granada, our mother earth, will receive her children into her bosom safe from the chains and oppressions of the conqueror. Or should any fail a sepulchre to hide his remains, he will not want a sky to cover him. Allah forbid it should be said the nobles of Granada feared to die in her defense. Musa ceased to speak, and a dead silence reigned in the assembly. Boabdil looked anxiously round and scanned every face, but he read in all the anxiety of careworn men, in whose hearts enthusiasm was dead, and who had grown callous to every chivalrous appeal. Allah Akbar, exclaimed he, there is no God but God, and Mahomet is his prophet. We have no longer forces in the city, and the kingdom to resist our powerful enemies. It is in vain to struggle against the will of heaven too. Surely, was it written in the book of fate that I should be unfortunate, and the kingdom expire under my rule? Allah Akbar, echoed the viziers and alfaquis, the will of God be done. So they all agreed with the king that these evils were preordained, that it was hopeless to contend with them, and that the terms offered by the Castilian monarchs were as favorable as could be expected. When Musa heard them assent to the treaty of surrender, he rose in violent indignation. Do not deceive yourselves, cried he, nor think the Christians will be faithful to their promises, or their king as magnanimous in conquest, as he has been victorious in war. Death is the least we have to fear. It is the plundering and sacking of our city, the profanation of our mosques, the ruin of our homes, the violation of our wives and daughters, cruel oppression, bigoted intolerance, whips and chains, the dungeon, the faggot, and the stake. Such are the miseries and indignities we shall see and suffer. At least those groveling souls will see and suffer them, who now shrink from an honorable death. For my part, by Allah, I will never witness them. With these words he left the council chamber, and passed gloomily through the court of lions and the outer halls of the Alhambra, without deigning to speak to the obsequious courtiers who attended in them. He repaired to his dwelling, armed himself at all points, mounted his favorite war horse, and issuing from the city by the gate of Elvira, was never seen or heard of more. Condi Part 4. Chapter Roman 98. Commotions in Granada. The capitulation for the surrender of Granada was signed on the 25th of November 1481, and produced a sudden cessation of those hostilities, which had raged for so many years. Christian and Moor might now be seen mingling courteously on the banks of the Zenil and the Darro, where to have met a few days previous would have produced a scene of sanguinary contest. Still, as the Moors might be suddenly roused to the defense, if within the allotted term of 60 days succors should arrive from abroad, and as they were at all times a rash inflammable people, the wary Ferdinand maintained a vigilant watch upon the city, and permitted no supplies of any kind to enter his garrisons in the seaports, and his cruisers in the Straits of Gibraltar were ordered likewise to guard against any relief from the Grand Soldan of Egypt or the princes of Barbary. There was no need of such precautions. Those powers were either too much engrossed by their own wars, or too much daunted by the success of the Spanish arms to interfere in a desperate cause, and the unfortunate Moors of Granada were abandoned to their fate. The month of December had nearly passed away, the famine became extreme, and there was no hope of any favorable event within the term specified. In the capitulation, Boabdil saw that to hold out to the end of the allotted time would but be to protract the miseries of his people. With the consent of his council, he determined to surrender the city on the 6th of January. He accordingly sent his Grand Vizier Yusuf Ibn Comixa to King Ferdinand to make known his intention, bearing him at the same time a present of a magnificent cimeter, and 2 Arabian steeds superbly caparisoned. The unfortunate Boabdil was doomed to meet with trouble to the end of his career. The very next day the Santon, or Dervise Hamet, Aben Zarax, the same who had uttered prophecies and excited commotions on former occasions, suddenly made his appearance. Whence he came no one knew. It was rumored that he had been in the mountains of the Alpuxerras, and on the coast of Barbary, endeavoring to rouse the Moslems to the relief of Granada. He was reduced to a skeleton, his eyes glowed like coals in their sockets, and his speech was little better than frantic raving. He harangued the populace in the streets and squares, inveighed against the capitulation, denounced the king and nobles as Moslems only in name, and called upon the people to sally forth against the unbelievers, for that Allah had decreed them a signal victory. Upward of 20,000 of the populace seized their arms and paraded the streets with shouts and outcries. The shops and houses were shut up. The king himself did not dare to venture forth, but remained a kind of prisoner in the Alhambra. The turbulent multitude continued roaming and shouting and howling about the city during the day, and a part of the night hunger and a wintry tempest tamed their frenzy. And when morning came, the enthusiast who had led them on had disappeared, whether he had been disposed of by the emissaries of the king or by the leading men of the city is not known. His disappearance remains a mystery. Mariana, Boabdil now issued from the Alhambra, attended by his principal nobles, and harangued the populace. He set forth the necessity of complying with the capitulation from the famine that reigned in the city, the futility of defense, and from the hostages having already been delivered into the hands of the besiegers. In the dejection of his spirits, the unfortunate Boabdil attributed to himself the miseries of the country. It was my crime in ascending the throne in rebellion against my father, said he mournfully, which has brought these woes upon the kingdom. But Allah has grievously visited my sins upon my head. For your sake, my people, I have now made this treaty to protect you from the sword, your little ones from famine, your wives and daughters from outrage, and to secure you in the enjoyment of your properties, your liberties, your laws, and your religion under a sovereign of happier destinies than the ill-starred Boabdil. The versatile population were touched by the humility of their sovereign. They agreed to adhere to the capitulation, and there was even a faint shout of "Long live Boabdil, the unfortunate," and they all returned to their homes in perfect tranquility. Boabdil immediately sent missives to King Ferdinand, apprising him of these events and of his fears lest further delay should produce new tumults. The vizier Yusuf ibn Comixa was again the agent between the monarchs. He was received with unusual courtesy and attention by Ferdinand and Isabella, and it was arranged between them that the surrender should take place on the 2nd day of January, instead of the 6th. A new difficulty now arose in regard to the ceremonial of surrender. The haughty Ixalahora, whose pride rose with the decline of her fortunes, declared that as Sultan Amather, she would never consent that her son should stoop to the humiliation of kissing the hand of his conquerors, and unless this part of the ceremonial were modified, she would find means to resist a surrender accompanied by such indignities. Ibn Comixa was sorely troubled by this opposition. He knew the high spirit of the indomitable Aixa and her influence over her less heroic son, and wrote an urgent letter on the subject to his friend, the Count de Tendilla. The latter imparted the circumstance to the Christian sovereigns. A council was called on the matter. Spanish pride and etiquette were obliged to bend in some degree to the haughty spirit of a woman. It was agreed that Boabdil should sally forth on horseback, that on approaching the Spanish sovereigns, he should make a slight movement, as if about to draw his foot from the stirrup and dismount, but would be prevented from doing so by Ferdinand, who should treat him with a respect due to his dignity and elevated birth. The Count de Tendilla dispatched a messenger with this arrangement, and the haughty scruples of Aixa Lahora were satisfied. Salazar de Mendoza, Cron del Gran Cardinal Lib. 1 Roman 100 p1. Mondejar his MS as cited by Alcantara T. 4 Roman 100. Chapter Roman 99 Surrender of Granada. The night preceding the surrender was a night of doleful lamentings within the walls of the Alhambra, for the household of Boabdil were preparing to take a last farewell of that delightful abode. All the royal treasures and most precious effects were hastily packed upon mules. The beautiful apartments were despoiled with tears and wailings by their own inhabitants. Before the dawn of day, a mournful cavalcade moved obscurely out of a postern gate of the Alhambra and departed through one of the most retired quarters of the city. It was composed of the family of the unfortunate Boabdil, which he sent off thus privately, that they might not be exposed to the eyes of scoffers or the exultation of the enemy. The mother of Boabdil, the Sultana Aixa Lahora, rode on, in silence with dejected yet dignified demeanor. But his wife Morema, and all the females of his household, gave way to loud lamentations, as they looked back upon their favorite abode. Now, a mass of gloomy towers behind them, they were attended by the ancient domestics of the household, and by a small guard of veteran Moors loyally attached to the fallen monarch, and who would have sold their lives dearly in defense of his family. The city was yet buried in sleep. As they passed through its silent streets, the guards at the gate shed tears. As they opened it for their departure, they paused not but proceeded along the banks of the Zenil, on the road that leads to the Alpuxerras, until they arrived at a hamlet at some distance from the city, where they halted and waited until they should be joined by King Boabdil. The night, which had passed so gloomily in the sumptuous halls of the Alhambra, had been one of joyful anticipation in the Christian camp. In the evening, proclamation had been made that Granada was to be surrendered on the following day, and the troops were all ordered to assemble at an early hour under their several banners. The cavaliers, pages, and esquires were all charged to array themselves in their richest and most splendid style for the occasion, and even the royal family determined to lay by the morning. They had recently assumed for the sudden death of the Prince of Portugal, the husband of the Princess Isabella. In a clause of the capitulation, it had been stipulated that the troops destined to take possession should not traverse the city but should ascend to the Alhambra by a road opened for the purpose outside of the walls. This was to spare the feelings of the afflicted inhabitants, and to prevent any angry collision between them and their conquerors. So rigorous was Ferdinand in enforcing this precaution, that the soldiers were prohibited under pain of death from leaving the ranks to enter into the city. The rising sun had scarce shed his rosy beams upon the snowy summits of the Sierra Nevada, when 3 signal guns boomed heavily from the lofty fortress of the Alhambra. It was the concerted sign that all was ready for the surrender. The Christian army forthwith poured out of the city, or rather camp, of Santa Fe, and advanced across the Vega. The king and queen, with the prince and princess, the dignitaries and ladies of the court, took the lead, accompanied by the different orders of monks and friars, and surrounded by the royal guards, splendidly arrayed. The procession moved slowly forward, and paused at the village of Armilla, at the distance of half a league from the city. In the meantime, the Grand Cardinal of Spain, Don Pedro González de Mendoza, escorted by 3,000 foot and a troop of cavalry, and accompanied by the commander Don Gutierrez de Cardenas, and a number of prelates and hidalgos, crossed the Zenil, and proceeded in the advance to ascend to the Alhambra, and take possession of that royal palace, and fortress. The road which had been opened for the purpose, led by the Puerta de los Molinos, or Gate of Mills, up a defile to the Esplanade on the summit of the Hill of Martyrs. At the approach of this detachment, the Moorish king sallied forth from a postern gate of the Alhambra, having left his vizier Yusuf ben Comixa to deliver up the palace. The gate by which he sallied passed through a lofty tower of the outer wall, called the Tower of the 7 Floors de los Siete Suelos. He was accompanied by 50 cavaliers, and approached the Grand Cardinal on foot. The latter immediately alighted, and advanced to meet him with the utmost respect. They stepped aside a few paces, and held a brief conversation in an undertone, when Boabdil, raising his voice, exclaimed, "Go, Senor, and take possession of those fortresses, in the name of the powerful sovereigns, to whom God has been pleased to deliver them, in reward of their great merits." And in punishment of the sins of the Moors, the Grand Cardinal sought to console him in his reverses, and offered him the use of his own tent during any time he might sojourn in the camp. Boabdil thanked him for the courteous offer, adding some words of melancholy import, and then, taking leave of him, gracefully passed mournfully on to meet the Catholic sovereigns descending to the Vega, by the same road by which the cardinal had come. The latter, with the prelates and cavaliers who attended him, entered the Alhambra, the gates of which were thrown wide open by the Alcaide ben Comixa. At the same time, the Moorish guards yielded up their arms, and the towers and battlements were taken possession of by the Christian troops. While these transactions were passing in the Alhambra and its vicinity, the sovereigns remained with their retinue and guards near the village of Armilla, their eyes fixed on the towers of the royal fortress, watching for the appointed signal of possession. The time that had elapsed since the departure of the detachment seemed to them more than necessary for the purpose, and the anxious mind of Ferdinand began to entertain doubts of some commotion in the city. At length, they saw the silver cross, the great standard of this crusade, elevated on the Torre de la Villa, or Great Watchtower, and sparkling in the sunbeams. This was done by Hernando de Talavera, Bishop of Avila. Beside it was planted the pennon of the glorious apostle St. James, and a great shout of Santiago, Santiago rose throughout the army. Lastly, was reared the royal standard by the king at arms, with the shout of Castile, Castile, for King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella. The words were echoed by the whole army with acclamations that resounded across the Vega. At sight of these signals of possession, the sovereigns sank upon their knees, giving thanks to God for this great triumph. The whole assembled host followed their example, and the choristers of the royal chapel broke forth into the solemn anthem of Te Deum Laudamus. The king now advanced with a splendid escort of cavalry and the sound of trumpets, until he came to a small mosque near the banks of the Zenil, and not far from the foot of the Hill of Martyrs, which edifice remains to the present day, consecrated as the Hermitage of St. Sebastian. Here he beheld the unfortunate King of Granada approaching on horseback at the head of his slender retinue. Boabdil, as he drew near, made a movement to dismount, but as had previously been concerted, Ferdinand prevented him. He then offered to kiss the king's hand, which according to arrangement was likewise declined, whereupon he leaned forward and kissed the king's right arm at the same time, He delivered the keys of the city with an air of mingled melancholy and resignation. These keys, said he, are the last relics of the Arabian Empire in Spain. Then, O king, are our trophies our kingdom, and our person such is the will of God. Receive them with the clemency thou hast promised, and which we look for at thy hands. Abarca Annals de Aragon, Ray 30 Roman 100. King Ferdinand restrained his exultation into an air of serene magnanimity. Doubt not our promises, replied he, nor that thou shalt regain from our friendship the prosperity of which the fortune of war has deprived thee. Being informed that Don Inigo Lopez de Mendoza, the good Count of Tendilla, was to be governor of the city, Boabdil drew from his finger a gold ring set with a precious stone, and presented it to the Count. With this ring said, he, Granada has been governed, take it, and govern with it, and God make you more fortunate than I. This ring remained in the possession of the descendants of the Count until the death of the Marquis Don Inigo, the last male heir, who died in Malaga without children in 1656. The ring was then lost. Through inadvertence and ignorance of its value, Dona Maria, the sister of the Marquis, being absent in Madrid, Alcantara, 14 Roman 100. He then proceeded to the village of Armilla, where the Queen Isabella remained with her escort and attendants. The Queen, like her husband, declined all acts of homage, and received him with her accustomed grace and benignity. She at the same time delivered to him his son, who had been held as a hostage for the fulfillment of the capitulation. Boabdil pressed his child to his bosom with tender emotion, and they seemed mutually endeared to each other by their misfortunes. Zurita Annals de Aragon, lib 20, cap 92. Having rejoined his family, the unfortunate Boabdil continued on toward the Alpuxerras that he might not behold the entrance of the Christians into his capital. His devoted band of cavaliers followed him in gloomy silence, but heavy sighs burst from their bosoms, as shouts of joy and strains of triumphant music were borne on the breeze from the victorious army. Having rejoined his family, Boabdil set forth with a heavy heart for his allotted residence in the valley of Perchina. At 2 leagues' distance, the cavalcade, winding into the skirts of the Alpuxerras, ascended an eminence commanding the last view of Granada. As they arrived at this spot, the Moors paused involuntarily to take a farewell gaze at their beloved city, which a few steps more would shut from their sight for ever. Never had it appeared so lovely in their eyes. The sunshine, so bright in that transparent climate, lit up each tower and minaret, and rested gloriously upon the crowning battlements of the Alhambra, while the Vega spread its enameled bosom of verdure below, glistening with the silver windings of the Zenil. The Moorish cavaliers gazed with a silent agony of tenderness and grief upon that delicious abode, the scene of their loves and pleasures, while they yet looked. A light cloud of smoke burst forth from the citadel, and presently a peal of artillery, faintly heard, told that the city was taken possession of, and the throne of the Moslem kings was lost for ever. The heart of Boabdil, softened by misfortunes and overcharged with grief, could no longer contain itself. Allah Akbar, God is great, said he, but the words of resignation died upon his lips, and he burst into tears. The mother, the intrepid Aixa, was indignant at his weakness. You do well, said she, to weep like a woman for what you failed to defend like a man. The vizier Aben Comixa endeavored to console his royal master. Consider, Senor, said he, that the most signal misfortunes often render men as renowned as the most prosperous achievements, provided they sustain them with magnanimity. The unhappy monarch, however, was not to be consoled. His tears continued to flow. Allah Akbar, exclaimed he, when did misfortune ever equal mine? From this circumstance, the hill which is not far from Padel took the name of Feg Allah Akbar, but the point of view commanding the last prospect of Granada is known among Spaniards by the name of El Ultimo Suspiro del Moro, or the last sigh of the Moor. Chapter Roman 100, How the Castilian sovereigns took possession of Granada. Queen Isabella, having joined the king, the royal pair, followed by a triumphant host, passed up the road by the Hill of Martyrs, and thence to the main entrance of the Alhambra. The Grand Cardinal awaited them, under the lofty arch of the Great Gate of Justice, accompanied by Don Gutierrez de Cardenas, and Aben Comixa. Here King Ferdinand gave the keys which had been delivered up to him into the hands of the Queen. They were passed successively into the hands of the Prince Juan, the Grand Cardinal, and finally into those of the Count de Tendilla, in whose custody they remained, that brave cavalier having been named Alcaide of the Alhambra and Captain General of Granada. The sovereigns did not remain long in the Alhambra on this first visit, but leaving a strong garrison there, under the Count de Tendilla, to maintain tranquility in the palace, and the subjacent city returned to the camp at Santa Fe. We must not omit to mention a circumstance attending the surrender of the city, which spoke eloquently to the hearts of the victors, as the royal army had advanced in all the pomp of courtly and chivalrous array. A procession of a different kind came forth to meet it. This was composed of more than 500 Christian captives, many of whom had languished for years in Moorish dungeons. Pale and emaciated, they came clanking their chains in triumph and shedding tears of joy. They were received with tenderness by the sovereigns. The king hailed them as good Spaniards, as men loyal and brave, as martyrs to the holy cause. The queen distributed liberal relief among them with her own hands, and they passed on before the squadrons of the army singing hymns of jubilee. Abarca lib sup zurita, etc. The sovereigns forbore to enter the city, until it should be fully occupied by their troops and public tranquillity. Ensured, all this was done under the vigilant superintendence of the Count de Tendilla, assisted by the marks of Valina, and the glistening of Christian helms and lances, along the walls and bulwarks, and the standards of the faith and of the realm. Daunting from the towers told that the subjugation of the city was complete. The proselyte Prince Cid Haya, now known by the Christian appellation of Don Pedro de Granada Vengas, was appointed chief alguazil of the city, and had charge of the Moorish inhabitants, and his son lately, the Prince Ulnayar, now Alonso de Granada Vengas, was appointed admiral of the fleet. Cid Haya was made cavalier of the Order of Santiago he and his son intermarried with the Spanish nobility and the Marquesas of Campojar are among their descendants. Their portraits and the portraits of their grandsons are to be seen in one of the rooms of the Generalife at Granada. It was on the 6th of January, the Day of Kings, and festival of the Epiphany, that the sovereigns made their triumphant entry with grand military parade. First advanced, we are told, a splendid escort of cavaliers in burnished armor, and superbly mounted. Then followed the Prince Juan, glittering with jewels and diamonds on each side of him. Mounted on mules rode the Grand Cardinal, clothed in purple, Fray Hernando de Talavera, Bishop of Erla, and the Archbishop-elect of Granada. To these succeeded the Queen and her ladies, and the King managing in galliard style, say the Spanish chroniclers, a proud and mettlesome steed, un caballo arrogante. Then followed the army in shining columns with flaunting banners, and the inspiring clamor of military music. The King and Queen, says the worthy Fray Antonio Agapida, looked on this occasion as more than mortal the venerable ecclesiastics, to whose advice and zeal this glorious conquest ought in a great measure be attributed, moved along with hearts swelling with holy exultation, but with chastened and downcast looks of edifying humility, while the hardy warriors in tossing plumes and shining steel seemed elevated with a stern joy at finding themselves in possession of this object of so many toils and perils. As the streets resounded with the tramp of steeds and swelling peals of music, the Moors buried themselves in the deepest recesses of their dwellings. There they bewailed in secret the fallen glory of their race, but suppressed their groans, lest they should be heard by their enemies, and increase their triumph. The royal procession advanced to the principal mosque, which had been consecrated as a cathedral. Here the sovereigns offered up prayers and thanksgivings, and the choir of the royal chapel chanted a triumphant anthem, in which they were joined by all the courtiers and cavaliers. Nothing, says Fray Antonio Agapida, could exceed the thankfulness to God of the pious King Ferdinand, for having enabled him to eradicate from Spain the empire and name of that accursed heathen race, and for the elevation of the cross in that city, wherein the impious doctrines of Mahomet had so long been cherished in the fervor of his spirit. He supplicated from heaven a continuance of its grace, and that this glorious triumph might be perpetuated. The prayer of the pious monarch was responded to by the people, and even his enemies were for once convinced of his sincerity. The words of Fray Antonio Agapida are little more than an echo of those of the worthy Jesuit Father Mariana, 125 Roman 100. When the religious ceremonies were concluded, the court ascended to the stately palace of the Alhambra, and entered by the great gate of justice. The halls lately occupied by turbaned infidels now rustled with stately dames and Christian courtiers, who wandered with eager curiosity over this far-famed palace, admiring its verdant courts and gushing fountains, its halls decorated with elegant arabesques, and storied with inscriptions, and the splendor of its gilded and brilliantly painted ceilings. It had been a last request of the unfortunate Boabdil, one which showed how deeply he felt the transition of his faith, that no person might be permitted to enter or depart by the gate of the Alhambra, through which he had sallied forth to surrender his capital. His request was granted, the portal was closed up, and remains so to the present day, a mute memorial of that event. Garibe compend hist. lib 40 Roman 100, the existence of this gateway and the story connected with it are perhaps known to few but were identified in the researches made to verify this history. The gateway is at the bottom of a tower at some distance from the main body of the Alhambra. The tower had been rent and ruined by gunpowder at the time when the fortress was evacuated by the French. Great masses lie around, half covered by vines and fig trees. A poor man by the name of Matteo Ximenes, who lives in one of the halls among the ruins of the Alhambra where his family has resided for many generations, pointed out to the author the gateway still closed up with stones. He remembered to have heard his father and grandfather say that it had always been stopped up and that out of it King Boabdil had gone when he surrendered Granada. The route of the unfortunate king may be traced thence across the garden of the convent of Los Martiros and down a ravine beyond, through a street of gypsy caves and hovels by the gate of Los Molinos, and so on to the hermitage of St. Sebastian. None but an antiquarian, however, will be able to trace it, unless aided by the humble historian of the place, Matteo Ximenes. The Spanish sovereigns fixed their throne in the present chamber of the palace, so long the seat of Moorish royalty. Hither the principal inhabitants of Granada repaired to pay them homage and kiss their hands in token of vassalage, and their example was followed by deputies from all the towns and fortresses of the Alpuxerras, which had not hitherto submitted. Thus terminated the War of Granada, after 10 years of incessant fighting, equaling, says Fray Antonio Agapida, the far-famed siege of Troy in duration, and ending like that in the capture of the city. Thus ended also the dominion of the Moors in Spain, having endured 778 years, from the memorable defeat of Roderick, the last of the Goths, on the banks of the Guadalete. The authentic Agapida is uncommonly particular in fixing the epoch of this event. This great triumph of our holy Catholic faith, according to his computation, took place in the beginning of January, in the year of our Lord 1492, being 3655 years, from the population of Spain, by the Patriarch Tubal 3797, from the general deluge 5453, from the creation of the world, according to Hebrew calculation, and in the month Rabic in the 897th year of the Hejira, or flight of Mahomet, whom may God confound, saith the pious Agapida. Appendix. The Chronicle of the Conquest of Granada is finished, but the reader may be desirous of knowing the subsequent fortunes of some of the principal personages. The unfortunate Boabdil retired with his mother, his wife, his son, his sister, his vizier, and bosom counselor Aben Comixa, and many other relatives and friends, to the valley of Perchina, where a small but fertile territory had been allotted him, comprising several towns of the Alpuxerras, with all their rights and revenues, here surrounded by obedient vassals, devoted friends, and a loving family, and possessed of wealth sufficient to enable him to indulge in his habitual luxury and magnificence. He for a time led a tranquil life, and may have looked back upon his regal career as a troubled dream from which he had happily awaked. Still, he appears to have pleased himself with a shadow of royalty, making occasionally progresses about his little domains, visiting the different towns, receiving the homage of the inhabitants, and bestowing largesses with a princely hand. His great delight, however, was in sylvan sports, and exercises with horses, hawks, and hounds, being passionately fond of hunting and falconry, so as to pass weeks together in sporting campaigns among the mountains. The jealous suspicions of Ferdinand followed him into his retreat. No exertions were spared by the politically pious monarch to induce him to embrace the Christian religion as a means of severing him in feelings and sympathies from his late subjects, but he remained true to the faith of his fathers, and it must have added not a little to his humiliation to live a vassal under Christian sovereigns. His obstinacy in this respect aggravated the distrust of Ferdinand, who, looking back upon the past inconstancy of the Moors, could not feel perfectly secure in his newly conquered territories, while there was one within their bounds who might revive pretensions to the throne and rear the standard of an opposite faith in their behalf. He caused, therefore, a vigilant watch to be kept upon the dethroned monarch in his retirement, and beset him with spies who were to report all his words and actions. The reader will probably be surprised to learn that the foremost of these spies was Aben Comixa, ever since the capture and release of the niece of the vizier by the Count de Tendilla. Aben Comixa had kept up a friendly correspondence with that nobleman, and through this channel had gradually been brought over to the views of Ferdinand documents, which have gradually come to light, leave little doubt that the vizier had been corrupted by the bribes and promises of the Spanish king, and had greatly promoted his views in the capitulation of Granada. It is certain that he subsequently received great estates from the Christian sovereigns while residing in confidential friendship with Boabdil in his retirement. Aben Comixa communicated secretly with Hernando de Zafra, the secretary of Ferdinand, who resided at Granada, giving him information of all Boabdil's movements, which the secretary reported by letter to the king. Some of the letters of the secretary still exist in the archives of Samancas and have been recently published in the collection of unedited documents. El Rey Muli Babdali Boabdil, y sus criados andan continuamente. Acasacan Glagos y Azores y ala esta agora, en al campo de Dalias y en. Verja onc su casatine, en Andarax y dican que estara a la portadu. Est mes carta secreta de Hernando de Zafra December, 1492. The jealous doubts of Ferdinand were quickened by the letters of his spies. He saw in the hunting campaigns and royal progresses of the ex-king a mode of keeping up a military spirit and a concerted intelligence among the Moors of the Alpuxerras that might prepare them for future rebellion. By degrees, the very residence of Boabdil within the kingdom became incompatible with Ferdinand's ideas of security. He gave his agents, therefore, secret instructions to work upon the mind of the deposed monarch and induce him, like El Zagal, to relinquish his Spanish estates for valuable considerations and retire to Africa. Boabdil, however, was not to be persuaded to the urgent suggestions of these perfidious counselors. He replied that he had given up a kingdom to live in peace, and had no idea of going to a foreign land to encounter new troubles and to be under the control of Arabs. Letter of Hernando de Zafra to the Sovereigns, Dec 9, 1493. Ferdinand persisted in his endeavors and found means more effectual of operating on the mind of Boabdil, and gradually disposing him to enter into negotiations. It would appear that Aben Comixa was secretly active in this matter, in the interests of the Spanish monarch, and was with him at Barcelona as the vizier and agent of Boabdil. The latter, however, finding that his residence in the Alpuxerras was a cause of suspicion and uneasiness to Ferdinand, determined to go himself to Barcelona, have a conference with the sovereigns, and conduct all his negotiations with them in person. Zafra, the secretary of Ferdinand, who was ever on the alert, wrote a letter from Granada apprising the king of Boabdil's intention, and that he was making preparations for the journey. He received a letter in reply, charging him by subtle management to prevent, or at least delay, the coming of Boabdil, to court the crafty monarch, trusted to effect through Aben Comixa as vizier and agent of Boabdil, an arrangement which it might be impossible to obtain from Boabdil himself. The politic plan was carried into effect. Boabdil was detained at Andarax by the management of Zafra. In the meantime, a scandalous bargain was made on the 17th March 1493 between Ferdinand and Aben Comixa, in which the latter, as vizier and agent of Boabdil, though without any license or authority from him, made a sale of his territory and the patrimonial property of the princesses for 80,000 ducats of gold, and engaged that he should depart for Africa, taking care at the same time to make conditions highly advantageous for himself. Letter of the Sovereigns to Hernando de Zafra from Barcelona. Feb 1493. Alcantara hist graned Roman for Roman 100. This bargain being hastily concluded, Yusef Aben Comixa loaded the treasure upon mules and departed for the Alpuxerras. Here, spreading the money before Boabdil Sr., said he, I have observed that as long as you live here you are exposed to constant peril. The Moors are rash and irritable, they may make some sudden insurrection, elevate your standard as a pretext, and thus overwhelm you and your friends with utter ruin. I have observed also that you pine away with grief, being continually reminded in this country that you were once its sovereign, but never more must hope to reign. I have put an end to these evils. Your territory is sold, polled, the price of it. With this gold you may buy far greater possessions in Africa, where you may live in honor and security. When Boabdil heard these words, he burst into a sudden transport of rage, and drawing his cimeter, would have sacrificed the officious Yusef on the spot, had not the attendants interfered and hurried the vizier from his presence. Marmal Rebel 1 Roman 100. The rage of Boabdil gradually subsided. He saw that he had been duped and betrayed, but he knew the spirit of Ferdinand too well to hope that he would retract the bargain, however illegitimately effected. He contented himself, therefore, with obtaining certain advantageous modifications, and then prepared to bid a final adieu to his late kingdom and his native land. It took some months to make the necessary arrangements, or rather his departure was delayed by a severe domestic affliction. Morima, his gentle and affectionate wife, worn out by agitations and alarms, was gradually sinking into the grave, a prey to devouring melancholy. Her death took place. Toward the end of August, Hernando de Zafra apprised King Ferdinand of the event as one propitious to his purposes, removing an obstacle to the embarkation, which was now fixed for the month of September. Zafra was instructed to accompany the exiles until he saw them landed on the African coast. The embarkation, however, did not take place until sometime in the month of October. A carraca had been prepared at the port of Adra for Boabdil, and his immediate family and friends another carraca, and 2 galleots received a number of faithful adherents, amounting, it is said, to 1,100, and 30 who followed their prince into exile. A crowd of his former subjects witnessed his embarkation as the sails were unfurled and swelled to the breeze, and the vessel bearing Boabdil parted from the land. The spectators would fain have given him a farewell cheering, but the humbled state of their once proud sovereign forced itself upon their minds, and the ominous surname of his youth rose involuntarily to their tongues. Farewell Boabdil, Allah preserve the El Zagobai, burst spontaneously from their lips. The unlucky appellation sank into the heart of the expatriated monarch, and tears dimmed his eyes as the snowy summits of the mountains of Granada gradually faded from his view. He was received with welcome at the court of his relative Muley Ahmed, Caliph of Fez, the same who had treated El Zagal with such cruelty in his exile for 34 years. He resided in this court, treated with great consideration, and built a palace or alcazar at Fez, in which, it is said, he endeavored to emulate the beauties and delights of the Alhambra. The last we find recorded of him is in the year 1536, when he followed the Caliph to the field to repel the invasion of 2 brothers of the famous line of the Zarifs, who at the head of Berber troops had taken the city of Morocco and threatened Fez. The armies came in sight of each other on the banks of the Guadalhawit, or River of Slaves, at the fort of Balcuba. The river was deep, the banks were high and broken, and the ford could only be passed in single file. For 3 days the armies remained firing at each other across the stream, neither venturing to attempt the dangerous ford at length. The Caliph divided his army into 3 battalions. The command of the first he gave to his brother-in-law, and to Aliatar, son of the old Alcaide of Loxa, another division he commanded himself, and the third, composed of his best marksmen, he put under the command of his son, the Prince of Fez and Boabdil, now a gray-haired veteran. The last mentioned column took the lead, dashed boldly across the ford, scrambled up the opposite bank, and attempted to keep the enemy employed until the other battalions should have time to cross. The rebel army, however, attacked them with such fury that the son of the king of Fez and several of the bravest Alcaides were slain upon the spot. Multitudes were driven back into the river, which was already crowded with passing troops. A dreadful confusion took place. The horse trampled upon the foot, the enemy pressed on them with fearful slaughter. Those who escaped the sword perished by the stream. The river was choked by the dead bodies of men and horses, and by the scattered baggage of the army. In this scene of horrible carnage fell Boabdil, truly called El Zagobai, or the unlucky in instance, says the ancient chronicler of the scornful caprice of fortune, dying in defense of the kingdom of another, after wanting spirit to die in defense of his own. Marmal Descript de Africa p. 112, Roman 100 idem hist rebde. Los Moros lib. 1 Roman 100. The aspersion of the chronicler is more caustic than correct. Boabdil never showed a want of courage in the defense of Granada, but he wanted firmness and decision. He was beset from the first by perplexities, and ultimately by the artifices of Ferdinand and the treachery of those in whom he most confided. In revising this account of the ultimate fortunes of Boabdil, the author has availed himself of facts recently brought out in Alcantara's History of Granada, which throws strong lights on certain parts of the subject hitherto covered with obscurity. Zorya, the star of the morning. Notwithstanding the deadly rivalship of this youthful sultana with Aixa Lahora, the virtuous mother of Boabdil, and the disasters to which her ambitious intrigues gave rise, the placable spirit of Boabdil bore her no lasting enmity. After the death of his father, he treated her with respect and kindness, and evinced a brotherly feeling toward her sons Cad and Nazar. In the capitulations for the surrender of Granada, he took care of her interests, and the possessions which he obtained for her were in his neighborhood in the valleys of the Alpuxerras. Zorya, however, under the influence of Queen Isabella, returned to the Christian faith, the religion of her infancy, and resumed her Spanish name of Isabella, Her two sons, Cad and Nazar, were baptized under the names of Don Fernando and Don Juan de Granada, and were permitted to take the titles of infantas or princes. They intermarried with noble Spanish families, and the Dukes of Granada resident in Valladolid are descendants of Don Juan once Nazar, and preserve to the present day the blazon of their royal ancestor Muley Abul Hassan, and his motto Legalib il, Allah God alone is conqueror. Fate of Aben Comixa, an ancient chronicle which has long remained in manuscript, but has been published of late years in the collection of Spanish historical documents, informs us of the subsequent fortunes of the perfidious Aben Comixa, discarded and despised by Boabdil for his treachery. He repaired to the Spanish court and obtained favor in the eyes of the devout Queen Isabella by embracing the Christian religion, being baptized under her auspices with the name of Don Juan de Granada. He even carried his zeal for his newly adopted creed so far as to become a Franciscan friar. By degrees his affected piety grew cool, and the friar's garb became irksome, taking occasion of the sailing of some Venetian galleys from Almeria. He threw off his religious habit, embarked on board of one of them, and crossed to Africa, where he landed in the dress of a Spanish cavalier. Padilla Crónica de Felipe, El Hermosa cap 18y19 as cited by Alcantara. In a private interview with Abderrahman, the Moorish king of Bujia, he related his whole history, and declared that he had always been and still was at heart a true Mahometan. Such skill had he an inspiring confidence that the Moorish king took him into favor, and appointed him governor of Algiers while enjoying his new dignity. A Spanish squadron of 4 galleys under the celebrated Count Pedro de Navarro, anchored in the harbor in 1509. Aben Comixa paid the squadron a visit of ceremony in his capacity of governor, gave the count repeated fetes, and in secret conversations with him, laid open all the affairs of the king of Bujia, and offered, if the count should return, with sufficient force to deliver the city into his hands, and aid him in conquering the whole territory. The count hastened back to Spain, and made known the proposed treachery to the Cardinal Ximenes, then Prime Minister of Spain. In the following month of January, he was sent with 30 vessels and 4,000 soldiers to achieve the enterprise. The expedition of Navarro was successful. He made himself master of Bujia, and seized in triumph on the royal palace. But he found there the base Aben Comixa weltering in his blood, and expiring under numerous wounds. His treachery had been discovered, and the vengeance of the king of Bujia had closed his perfidious career. Death of the Marques of Cadiz. The renowned Rodrigo Ponce de Leon, Marquis Duke of Cadiz, was unquestionably the most distinguished among the cavaliers of Spain for his zeal, enterprise, and heroism in the Great Crusade of Granada. He began the war by the capture of Alhambra. He was engaged in almost every inroad and siege of importance during its continuance, and was present at the surrender of the capital. The closing scene of the conquest, the renown thus acquired, was sealed by his death, which happened in the 48th year of his age, almost immediately at the close of his triumphs, and before a leaf of his laurels had time to wither. He died at his palace in the city of Seville on the 27th day of August 1492, but a few months after the surrender of Granada, and of an illness caused by exposures and fatigues undergone in this memorable war. That honest chronicler Andres Bernaldez, the curate of Los Palacios, who was a contemporary of the Marques, draws his portrait from actual knowledge and observation. He was universally cited, says he, as the most perfect model of chivalrous virtue of the age. He was temperate, chaste, and rigidly devout, a benignant commander, a valiant defender of his vassals, a great lover of justice, and an enemy to all flatterers, liars, robbers, traitors, and poltroons. His ambition was of a lofty kind. He sought to distinguish himself and his family by heroic and resounding deeds, and to increase the patrimony of his ancestors by the acquisition of castles, domains, vassals, and other princely possessions. His recreations were all of a warlike nature. He delighted in geometry, as applied to fortifications, and spent much time and treasure in erecting and repairing fortresses. He relished music, but of a military kind, the sound of clarions and sackbuts of drums and trumpets. Like true cavalier, he was a protector of the sex on all occasions, and an injured woman never applied to him in vain for redress. His prowess was so well known, and his courtesy to the fair, that the ladies of the court, when they accompanied the queen to the wars, rejoiced to find themselves under his protection, for wherever his banner was displayed, the Moors dreaded to adventure. He was a faithful and devoted friend, but a formidable enemy, for he was slow to forgive, and his vengeance was persevering and terrible. The death of this good and well-beloved cavalier spread grief and lamentation throughout all ranks. His relations, dependents and companions in arms put on mourning for his loss. And so numerous were they that half of Seville was clad in black. None, however, deplored his death more deeply and sincerely than his friend and chosen companion, Don Alonso de Aguilar. The funeral ceremonies were of the most solemn and sumptuous kind. The body of the Marks was arrayed in a costly shirt, a doublet of brocade assayo or long robe of black velvet, a marlota or Moorish tunic of brocade, reaching to the feet and scarlet stockings. His sword superbly gilt was girded to his side, as he used to wear it when in the field thus magnificently attired. The body was enclosed in a coffin which was covered with black velvet and decorated with a cross of white damask. It was then placed on a sumptuous bier, in the center of the great hall of the palace. Here the Duchess made great lamentation over the body of her lord, in which she was joined by her train of damsels and attendants, as well as by the pages and esquires and innumerable vassals. In the close of the evening just before the Ave Maria, the funeral train issued from the palace. 10 banners were borne around the bier, the particular trophies of the Marks, won from the Moors, by his valor, in individual enterprises. Before King Ferdinand had commenced the War of Granada, the procession was swelled by an immense train of bishops, priests, and friars of different orders together with the civil and military authorities, and all the chivalry of Seville, headed by the Count of Cifuentes at that time, intendant or commander of the city. It moved slowly and solemnly through the streets, stopping occasionally and chanting litanies and responses. 240 waxen tapers shed a light like the day about the bier. The balconies and windows were crowded with ladies who shed tears as the funeral train passed by, while the women of the lower classes were loud in their lamentations, as if bewailing the loss of a father or a brother on approaching the convent of St. Augustine. The monks came forth with the cross and tapers and 8 censers, and conducted the body into the church where it lay in state, until all the vigils were performed by the different orders, after which it was deposited in the family tomb of the Ponces in the same church, and the 10 banners were suspended over the sepulchre. Cura de los Palacios, Roman 100. The tomb of the valiant Rodrigo Ponce de Leon, with his banners mouldering above it, remained for ages an object of veneration, with all who had read or heard of his virtues and achievements in the year 1810. However, the chapel was sacked by the French, its altars were overturned, and the sepulchres of the family of the Ponces shattered to pieces. The present Duchess of Benavente, the worthy descendant of this illustrious and heroic line, has since piously collected the ashes of her ancestors, restored the altar, and repaired the chapel. The sepulchres, however, were utterly destroyed. An inscription in gold letters on the wall of the chapel, to the right of the altar, is all that denotes the place of sepulture of the brave Ponce de Leon. The legend of the death of Don Alonso de Aguilar. To such as feel an interest in the fortune of the valiant Don Alonso de Aguilar, the chosen friend and companion in arms of Ponce de Leon, Marks of Cadiz, and one of the most distinguished heroes of the War of Granada, a few particulars of his remarkable fate will not be unacceptable. For several years after the conquest of Granada, the country remained feverish and unquiet. The zealous efforts of the Catholic clergy to effect the conversion of the infidels, and the coercion used for that purpose by government, exasperated the stubborn Moors of the mountains. Several missionaries were maltreated, and in the town of Darin, 2 of them were seized and exhorted with many menaces to embrace the Moslem faith. On their resolutely refusing, they were killed with staves and stones by the Moorish women and children, and their bodies burnt to ashes. Cura de los Palacios, Roman 100. Upon this event, a body of Christian cavaliers assembled in Andalusia, to the number of 800, and without waiting for orders from the king, revenged the death of these martyrs. By plundering and laying waste the Moorish towns and villages, the Moors fled to the mountains, and their cause was espoused by many of their nation who inhabited those rugged regions. The storm of rebellion began to gather, and mutter its thunders in the Alpuxerras. They were echoed from the Serrania of Ronda, ever ready for rebellion. But the strongest hold of the insurgents was in the Sierra 12 Bermeja, or chain of red mountains, which lie near the sea, the savage rocks and precipices of which may be seen from Gibraltar. When King Ferdinand heard of these tumults, he issued a proclamation ordering all the Moors of the insurgent regions to leave them within 10 days, and repair to Castile, giving secret instructions, however, that those who should voluntarily embrace the Christian faith might be permitted to remain. At the same time, he ordered Don Alonso de Aguilar and the Counts of Llerena and Cifuentes to march against the rebels. Don Alonso de Aguilar was at Cordova when he received the commands of the king what force is allotted us for this expedition, said he on being told, he perceived that the number of troops was far from adequate when a man is dead. Said he, we send 4 men into his house to bring forth the body we are now sent to chastise these Moors, who are alive vigorous in open rebellion, and ensconced in their castles. Yet they do not give us man to man. These words of the brave Alonso de Aguilar were afterward frequently repeated, but though he saw the desperate nature of the enterprise, he did not hesitate to undertake it. Don Alonso was at that time in the 51st year of his age a warrior, in whom the fire of youth was yet unquenched, though tempered by experience. The greater part of his life had been spent in camp and field, until danger was as his habitual element. His muscular frame had acquired the firmness of iron, without the rigidity of age. His armor and weapons seemed to have become a part of his nature, and he sat like a man of steel on his powerful war-horse. He took with him on this expedition his son Don Pedro de Cordova, a youth of bold and generous spirit in the freshness of his days, and armed and arrayed with the bravery of a young Spanish cavalier. When the populace of Cordova beheld the veteran father, the warrior of 1,000 battles, leading forth his son to the field, they bethought themselves of the family appellation. Behold, cried they, the eagle teaching his young to fly, long live the valiant line of Aguilar. Aguilar, the Spanish for eagle. The prowess of Don Alonso, and of his companions in arms, was renowned throughout the Moorish towns at their approach. Therefore numbers of the Moors submitted and hastened to Ronda to embrace Christianity. Among the mountaineers, however, were many of the Ganjuls, a tribe from Africa, too proud of spirit to bend their necks to the yoke. At their head was a Moor named El Ferry of Ben Estepar, renowned for strength and courage. At his instigation, his followers gathered together their families and most precious effects, placed them on mules, and driving before them their flocks and herds, abandoned their valleys, and retired up the craggy passes of the Sierra 13 Bermeja. On the summit was a fertile plain, surrounded by rocks and precipices, which formed a natural fortress. Here El Ferry placed all the women and children, and all the property by his orders. His followers piled great stones on the rocks and cliffs, which commanded the defiles and the steep sides of the mountain, and prepared to defend every pass that led to his place of refuge. The Christian commanders arrived and pitched their camp before the town of Monarda, a strong place curiously fortified and situated at the foot of the highest part of the Sierra 14 Bermeja. Here they remained for several days, unable to compel a surrender. They were separated from the skirt of the mountain by a deep barranca, or ravine, at the bottom of which flowed a small stream. The Moors, commanded by El Ferry, drew down from their mountain height, and remained on the opposite side of the brook, to defend a pass which led up to their stronghold. One afternoon, a number of Christian soldiers in mere bravado seized a banner, crossed the brook, and scrambling up the opposite bank, attacked the Moors. They were followed by numbers of their companions, some in aid, some in emulation, but most in hope of booty. A sharp action ensued on the mountainside. The Moors were greatly superior in number, and had the vantage ground. When the Counts of Llerena and Cifuentes beheld the skirmish, they asked Don Alonso de Aguilar his opinion. My opinion, said he, was given at Cordova, and remains the same. This is a desperate enterprise, however the Moors are at hand, and if they suspect weakness in us, it will increase their courage and our peril. Forward then to the attack, and I trust in God we shall gain a victory. So saying, he led his troops into the battle. Bleda 1-5 Roman 100. On the skirts of the mountain were several level places like terraces. Here the Christians pressed valiantly upon the Moors, and had the advantage, but the latter retreated to the steep and craggy heights, whence they hurled darts and rocks upon their assailants. They defended their passes and defiles with valor, but were driven from height to height, until they reached the plain on the summit of the mountain, where their wives and children were sheltered. Here they would have made a stand, but Alonso de Aguilar, with his son Don Pedro, charged upon them at the head of 300 men, and put them to flight with great carnage. While they were pursuing the flying enemy, the rest of the army, thinking the victory achieved, dispersed themselves over the little plain in search of plunder. They pursued the shrieking females, tearing off their necklaces, bracelets, and anklets of gold, and they found so much treasure of various kinds collected in this spot that they threw by their armor and weapons to load themselves with booty. Evening was closing. The Christians, intent upon spoil, had ceased to pursue the Moors, and the latter were arrested in their flight by the cries of their wives and children. Their leader El Ferry threw himself before them. Friends, soldiers, cried he, whither do you fly? Whither can you seek refuge? Where the enemy cannot follow you, your wives, your children are behind Udern, and defend them you have no chance for safety, but from the weapons in your hands. The Moors turned at his words. They beheld the Christians scattered about the plain, many of them without armor, and all encumbered with spoil now. Is the time, shouted Alferi, charge upon them, while laden with your plunder. I will open a path for you. He rushed to the attack, followed by his Moors with shouts and cries that echoed through the mountains. The scattered Christians were seized. With panic and throwing down, their booty began to fly in all directions. Don Alonso de Aguilar advanced his banner and endeavored to rally them, finding his horse of no avail in these rocky heights. He dismounted and caused his men to do the same. He had a small band of tried followers, with which he opposed a bold front to the Moors, calling on the scattered troops to rally in the rear. Night had completely closed. It prevented the Moors from seeing the smallness of the force with which they were contending, and Don Alonso and his cavaliers dealt their blows so vigorously that, aided by the darkness, they seemed multiplied to 10 times. Their number, unfortunately, a small cask of gunpowder, blew up near to the scene of action. It shed a momentary but brilliant light over all the plain, and on every rock and cliff the Moors beheld with surprise that they were opposed by a mere handful of men, and that the greater part of the Christians were flying from the field. They put up loud shouts of triumph, while some continued the conflict with redoubled ardor. Others pursued the fugitives, hurling after them stones and darts, and discharging showers of arrows. Many of the Christians, in their terror and their ignorance of the mountains, rushed headlong from the brinks of precipices, and were dashed in pieces. Don Alonso still maintained his ground, but while some of the Moors assailed him in front, others galled him with all kinds of missiles from the impending cliffs. Some of the cavaliers, seeing the hopeless nature of the conflict, proposed to abandon the height and retreat down the mountain. No, said Don Alonso, proudly, never did the banner of the House of Aguilar retreat 1 foot in the field of battle. He had scarcely uttered these words when his son Pedro was stretched at his feet. A stone hurled from a cliff had struck out 2 of his teeth, and a lance passed quivering through his thigh. The youth attempted to rise, and with one knee on the ground to fight by the side of his father. Don Alonso, finding him wounded, urged him to quit the field. Fly, my son, said he, let us not put everything at venture upon one. Hazard, conduct thyself as a good Christian, and live to comfort and honor thy mother. Don Pedro still refused to leave his side, whereupon Don Alonso ordered several of his followers to bear him off by force. His friend, Don Francisco Alvarez of Cordova, taking him in his arms, conveyed him to the quarters of the Count of Llerena, who had halted on the height at some distance from the scene of battle, for the purpose of rallying and succoring the fugitives. Almost at the same moment, the Count beheld his own son, Don Pedro Jairn, brought in grievously wounded. In the meantime, Don Alonso, with 200 cavaliers, maintained the unequal contest. Surrounded by foes, they fell one after another like so many stags encircled by the hunters. Don Alonso was the last survivor, without horse, and almost without armor, his corslet unlaced, and his bosom gashed with wounds. Still, he kept a brave front to the enemy, and retiring between 2 rocks, defended himself with such valor that the slain lay in a heap before him. He was assailed in this retreat by a Moor of surpassing strength and fierceness. The contest was for some time doubtful, but Don Alonso received a wound in the head and another in the breast, which made him stagger, closing and grappling with his foe. They had a desperate struggle, until the Christian cavalier, exhausted by his wounds, fell upon his back. He still retained his grasp upon his enemy. Think not, cried he, thou hast an easy prize. Know that I am Don Alonso, he of Aguilar. If thou art Don Alonso, replied the Moor, know that I am Alferi of Ben Estepar. They continued their deadly struggle, and both drew their daggers. But Don Alonso was exhausted by 7 ghastly wounds. While he was yet struggling, his heroic soul departed from his body, and he expired in the grasp of the Moor. Thus fell Alonso de Aguilar, the mirror of Andalusian chivalry, of the most powerful grandees of Spain, for person, blood, estate, and office for 40 years. He had made successful war upon the Moors in childhood, by his household and retainers in manhood, by the prowess of his arm, and in the wisdom and valor of his spirit. His pennon had always been foremost in danger. He had been general of armies, viceroy of Andalusia, and the author of glorious enterprises in which kings were vanquished, and mighty alcaides and warriors laid low. He had slain many Moslem chiefs with his own arm, and among others the renowned Ali Adder of Loxa, fighting foot to foot on the banks of the Zenil. His judgment, discretion, magnanimity, and justice vied with his prowess. He was the 5th lord of his warlike house that fell in battle with the Moors. His soul, observes the worthy Padre Abarca, it is believed ascended to heaven to receive the reward of so Christian a captain, for that very day he had armed himself with the sacraments of confession and communion. Abarca Annals de Aragon, Ray Roman 30, Cap Roman 2. The Moors, elated with their success, pursued the fugitive Christians down the defiles and sides of the mountains. It was with the utmost difficulty that the Count de Urena could bring off a remnant of his forces. From that disastrous height, fortunately on the lower slope of the mountain, they found the rear guard of the army led by the Count de Cifuentes, who had crossed the brook, and the ravine to come to their assistance as the fugitives came flying in headlong terror. Down the mountain it was with difficulty. The Count kept his own troops from giving way in panic, and retreating in confusion across the brook. He succeeded, however, in maintaining order in rallying the fugitives and checking the fury of the Moors, then taking his station on a rocky eminence. He maintained his post until morning, sometimes sustaining violent attacks, at other times rushing forth and making assaults upon the enemy. When morning dawned, the Moors ceased to combat and drew up to the summit of the mountain. It was then that the Christians had time to breathe, and to ascertain the sad loss they had sustained among the many valiant cavaliers who had fallen, was Don Francisco Ramirez of Madrid, who had been captain general of artillery throughout the War of Granada, and contributed greatly by his valor and ingenuity to that renowned conquest, but all other griefs and cares were forgotten in anxiety for the fate of Don Alonso de Aguilar. His son Don Pedro de Cordova had been brought off with great difficulty from the battle, and afterward lived to be Marks of Priego. But of Don Alonso, nothing was known except that he was left with a handful of cavaliers fighting valiantly against an overwhelming force. As the rising sun lighted up the red cliffs of the mountains, the soldiers watched with anxious eyes, if perchance his pennon might be descried fluttering from any precipice or defile. But nothing of the kind was to be seen. The trumpet call was repeatedly sounded, but empty echoes alone replied. A silence reigned about the mountain summit, which showed that the deadly strife was over now, and then a wounded warrior came dragging his feeble steps from among the cliffs and rocks. But on being questioned, he shook his head mournfully, and could tell nothing of the fate of his commander. The tidings of this disastrous defeat, and of the perilous situation of the survivors, reached King Ferdinand at Granada. He immediately marched at the head of all the chivalry of his court to the mountains of Ronda. His presence, with a powerful force, soon put an end to the rebellion. A part of the Moors were suffered to ransom themselves and embark for Africa. Others were made to embrace Christianity, and those of the town, where the Christian missionaries had been massacred, were sold as slaves from the conquered Moors. The mournful but heroic end of Alonso de Aguilar was ascertained. On the morning after the battle, when the Moors came to strip and bury the dead, the body of Don Alonso was found among those of more than 200 of his followers, many of them alcaides and cavaliers of distinction, though the person of Don Alonso was well known to the Moors, being so distinguished among them both in peace and war. Yet it was so covered and disfigured with wounds that it could with difficulty be recognized. They preserved it with great care, and on making their submission, delivered it up to King Ferdinand. It was conveyed with great state to Cordova, amidst the tears and lamentations of all Andalusia. When the funeral train entered Cordova, and the inhabitants saw the coffin containing the remains of their favorite hero, and the war horse led in mournful trappings, on which they had so lately seen him sally forth from their gates, there was a general burst of grief throughout the city. The body was interred with great pomp and solemnity in the church of St. Hippolyte. Many years afterward, his granddaughter Dona Catalina of Aguilar, and Cordova Marchioness of Priego, caused his tomb to be altered. On examining the body, the head of a lance was found among the bones, received without doubt among the wounds of his last mortal combat. The name of this accomplished and Christian cavalier has ever remained a popular theme of the chronicler and poet, and is endeared to the public memory by many of the historical ballads and songs of his country. For a long time, the people of Cordova were indignant at the brave Count de Urena, who they thought had abandoned Don Alonso in his extremity, but the Castilian monarch acquitted him of all charge of the kind, and continued him in honor and office. It was proved that neither he nor his people could succor Don Alonso, or even know his peril from the darkness of the night. There is a mournful little Spanish ballad, or romance, which breathes the public grief on this occasion, and the populace, on the return of the Count de Urena to Cordova, assailed him with one of its plaintive and reproachful verses. Count Urena, tell us, where is Don Alonso? Desid Condi Urena. Don Alonso Don Queta. Bleda 15 Roman 100.